The protagonist dreamt of the man again, but she just stood there frozen, helpless. After waking up, Sharon wondered if her powers were gone, since she hadn't used them in a long time. Just then, a man called out, "Sharon, you're awake." Just in time, Freelina sent someone with an invitation to the palace. Walking in the palace corridors, Sharon thought about how long it had been since a slave's feet had trod these grounds, a place that was once her home. Her homeland, Sersum Island, had fallen 10 years ago. 3 years later, they captured her in Pachon and sold her into slavery. When all the servants and slaves arrived in the inner palace, the steward, Catherine, gathered them together, saying she had an important announcement. She explained that the emperor was returning and the palace needed a large workforce. Grumbling spread through the crowd. Rumor had it that working for the mad emperor would drive one mad as well. Sharon noticed that this was the first time the servants and slaves had been gathered together. Pachon muttered that it meant the war was nearing its end. Sadly, the palace staff didn't respect the emperor. They all avoided him like the plague, terrified out of their wits. Emperor Julian had started the war, and now legend said he slaughtered servants and livestock daily. He'd been married twice, but both wives had died suddenly, and rumor attributed their deaths to him. Catherine asked for volunteers, adding that proactive slaves and servants would receive special benefits. She emphasized that the court work was very respectable, with a salary as high as 100 kron, but no one dared to volunteer. Everyone knew that 100 kron wasn't worth their lives. The steward then said that if no one volunteered for the castle duties, they would randomly select people from the crowd. Pachon complained that she should have just said that from the beginning, wasting everyone's time. Why did Sharon suddenly remember her dream? Perhaps the word majesty reminded her of the man who appeared in her mind every night. Pachon asked the sullen Sharon what was wrong. He wondered if she understood why there were such terrible rumors about the emperor. He pointed out that his majesty had been at war for many years, and usually such a person should be honored as a hero. Pachon guessed that Emperor Julian was seen as a mad butcher because of a witch's curse. When Sharon pressed for details, he said that 25 years ago, a woman was burned at the stake. It all started when an ordinary girl became a knight to defend Baldak during a long war. She seemed to have earned the empire's trust, but after the war, malicious rumors turned his majesty cruel. Emperor Julian made the woman who risked her life to save the country pay a heavy price. Rumors spread that the brave woman was a witch, and they tied her to the stake. The same voices that had cheered for her now screamed to light the fire and burn the devil's whore. Those who had praised her as a hero, who had given her their trust, had all been lying. She realized she had somehow offended the empire, and they had decided to unjustly eliminate her. Enraged, she cursed his majesty as a pile of waste, useless to this world. She screamed, wrongly accused, "Is this the price I pay for my loyalty to this country? To be burned alive. My only crime is my allegiance to the empire and my oath of loyalty as a knight." The woman tied to the stake demanded, "And what have you done as a ruler?" "Julian, you only flee the empire, leaving your people to fend for themselves." He, enraged and humiliated, roared, "Do it. Make the fire hotter. Smash her face." The crowd roared in fury. "A filthy witch dares to insult our great emperor. If I am truly a witch," she declared, "then I curse this pathetic ruler." Julian gloated to the crowd. "Listen, she admitted she's a witch. As the flames consumed her, she gasped from now on. The emperor will rot alive until only bone remains. The empire will have no loyal subjects, and his offspring will starve to death like slaves." She turned to the crowd. "You blindly believe the lies this ruler feeds you, not realizing you are nothing but toiling livestock." She spat. "Your words, the stones you throw, the fire you light, they're all worthless. They change nothing." The people clamored for a hotter fire, throwing more stones at the witch, wanting to silence her forever. As she died, she thought, "I wish I hadn't clung to hope until the very end." She decided that after death, she would become the wind, free from all restraints, living only for herself. Pachon concluded that from then on, no one wanted anything to do with the royal family, and every part of the witch's curse had come true. Sharon decided she had to be extra careful, as the empire would execute magic users, all thanks to that damned curse. She told Pachon she was going home to change, and he asked her to bring his clothes as well. Sharon knew that working for the cursed emperor was like walking into a lion's den, but the pay was 100 kron a week. She planned to save enough money to buy her freedom and pay off her parents' debts. In her mind, she was already a free woman, without debt, without shackles, and no one could control her anymore. Suddenly, a strong smell of blood assaulted Sharon's nose. Before she could blink, a cold blade pressed against her throat. A maid rushed in to tell Catherine that His Majesty had arrived and was heading alone to the training grounds. She said it was impossible. The Emperor wasn't due for another 3 days. But a man in blood-splattered armor was holding a weapon to the slave girl's throat, demanding to know who she was and what she was doing there. Her eyes adjusted to the darkness, and she saw a dead horse behind the thug. Sharon realized instantly that the killer emperor was standing before her. He demanded to know what she was doing there, but the dark aura around him was terrifying. She stammered that she'd wandered in by mistake. He just chuckled and said, "Everyone says that." She decided to run, refusing to surrender and let him kill her without a fight. Sharon was calculating how close he would get and how to lose this stalker. The man thought, what a pathetic, weak creature, and just a damn slave. Sharon cursed the man as a madman, demanding to know why he'd killed the horse. Good heavens, it was an imperial steed. He said he'd given the animal a noble death. The girl thought, does this killer take her for a complete fool? She couldn't figure out what this guy was playing at. Did he really think she believed the animal had begged for such a fate? Sharon's patience ran out. The madman was spouting nonsense. She brandished her rake, hoping to scare him off, but the man caught the other end of it in time. He lifted her single-handedly, stating, "The horse ate poisonous berries. An imperial horse deserves an honorable death." The girl was stunned. This was an imperial knight. Just then, Pachon's voice rang out nearby. The guy rushed towards the commotion, grabbing Sharon and seeing the imperial crest on the nearby man's blood-stained armor. As Pachan whispered in horror, "That's an imperial knight," the girl realized she was as good as dead for threatening him with a rake. The killer didn't stop. He continued to advance. She realized she didn't want to die here. Not now. Sharon bolted, grabbing a handful of dirt and throwing it directly into the killer's face. They escaped. Pachon asked, "Did we do the right thing?" That was an imperial knight. Sharon was amazed. How had Pachon recognized the imperial crest on his armor in the dark through all that blood? The girl felt embarrassed. She'd initially thought it was some evil spirit, hence the attack with her pitchfork. Sharon asked if they could just pretend nothing happened. Pachon speculated that perhaps it wasn't a knight, but the emperor himself. Same light-colored hair. Maybe. The girl snapped. That was pure nonsense. Everyone knew His Majesty wasn't arriving at the palace for 3 days. Moments later, news arrived that the procession had finally arrived, and the emperor himself was leading it. At the very front of the procession, Sharon saw the light-haired man, the one who had attacked her, covered in horse blood. The young man caught her eye amongst the crowd and grinned. Sharon couldn't believe it. But that very night, she found herself tied up before the man she'd thrown dirt at. He called her rat and said he'd caught her to finally get some answers, her identity and what she was doing there. Soon, the girl, disguised as a palace maid, was pushing a food cart through the palace. As she walked, she eavesdropped on the servants' gossip. They were all puzzled by Emperor Julian's sudden return. Some believed the emperor had sensed danger, as the Chancellor Albert had ruled for years after his father's death. They whispered of a bloody era to come, but Sharon paid no mind. Rumors were irrelevant to her. Sharon strode into the stables, calling for Pachon, saying she'd brought him food, claiming she'd helped the palace staff today. But the room was empty, Pachon's bed neatly made. She blinked. Hadn't they finished work just hours ago? A stern male voice demanded, "Who are you? Who hired you?" Sharon had no idea what they were talking about. He assumed Chancellor Albert had sent her spy on him, but she kept denying it. She retorted to the ruler, asking why someone as noble as him would bother with a slave. His Majesty ignored the question, countering, "So that's why the slave tried to attack you and then ran away." The young man added, "Everyone knows Albert has eyes and ears everywhere in the palace, including slaves." She shrieked, "I didn't even know he was the emperor or how he'd killed his own horse." The young man pressed, "So you thought he was a murderer?" Sharon babbled, "I'm just a slave. The emperor shouldn't even be listening to me." She added, "I was disrespectful. I just misunderstood. Your Majesty gave your horse a noble death." The young man murmured, "She's not Albert's only informant." This is typical of the Chancellor, always trying to gain an advantage. The emperor said, "My warhorse was well trained, served me for years." Then it walks into the palace and gorges itself on poison berries. The young ruler concluded, "What a coincidence. The chancellor must want me dead." The emperor said, "The slave has a sharp tongue, but let's see if her story matches the one from the person she works with." Last night, he'd given the order to his aide. Moments later, they dragged Pachon past the bound Sharon and the emperor. The man barely had a chance to call out Sharon's name before he was dragged into a room. The girl froze, hearing the roar of a lion. The emperor sneered, saying it was now up to the man himself, whether to live or die or become a lion's meal. Sharon was confused. Did Emperor Julian really think she was a man? She figured the emperor thought so because of the manure smell on her and the men's clothes she wore. Meanwhile, the lion lunged out of its cage, straight for Pacon. Luckily, there were a few rakes nearby, and he grabbed one to use as a weapon. The girl pleaded with the emperor to spare the poor man, saying he was innocent and that she would take his place. His Majesty laughed, saying no one was stopping the slave. He was free to go, but he had to prove his innocence. The lion kept closing in, leaping and roaring. Pachon kept hitting it with the rake, but it was clear his chances of survival were zero. The girl couldn't bear to watch any longer. To stop the unfair fight, she screamed at the top of her lungs, saying she would prove his innocence. The emperor snapped his fingers, ordering the lion to stop. The lion immediately quieted down, and Pachon was finally able to catch his breath. His Majesty told Sharon to begin. She said that she and her brother were just ordinary slaves. She added that for 3 years, they had only been responsible for feeding the horses and cleaning the stables, and they were strictly forbidden to leave the estate. She clarified that neither she nor her sibling had ever seen the emperor. She questioned which of them could possibly be a spy. Suddenly, Sharon fell silent, realizing that words alone were not enough. She had to come up with a strong answer, or her companions would all die. She silently prayed to herself to think of something convincing. Then it hit her. She remembered the man from her dream. She realized the man in her dream was the emperor. The fear she felt upon waking was a premonition of today's events. She remembered that in the dream, the man was very afraid, trembling like a child, clutching his sword to his chest. She asked the emperor if he could let go of his sword after dark. She said she could help him sleep soundly. The young ruler angrily complained that it was all nonsense, as he wasn't afraid of the dark at all. Sharon told him she had a way to make his Majesty eagerly anticipate the arrival of night. She promised it would make the emperor's blood boil and bring him pure pleasure. His attendant almost fell off his chair. After all, he was a man. Hours later, a half-asleep Julian was already sitting on his bed, rubbing his sword. Hearing approaching footsteps, he muttered, "That fellow is finally here." But when he looked up, he saw a beautiful woman standing there. She bowed and greeted his Majesty, saying she had come as promised during the interrogation. Julian recalled his earlier conversation with his attendant, trying to figure out how the interrogated fellow knew about his nightly troubles. He realized he hadn't told anyone, but Collins reported to his Majesty that no contact between the slaves and the opposition had been found. The attendant concluded that there was no more intelligence from the spy, but he had to admit that the slaves didn't seem to be relatives. Collins added that he had thought the interrogated fellow was a reckless lad, but it turned out to be a woman. The emperor scoffed, "This is utter nonsense. Someone is spreading damned lies to tarnish my reputation." Collins tried to argue, but his Majesty ignored the attendant's protests, declaring their eyesight was fine and ordering him to get out. The red-haired man mused that it would be interesting to see what kind of treatment the captured slave, who turned out to be a girl, would use to cure his Majesty. When the emperor saw the woman, he immediately demanded, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" She identified herself as the slave Sharon and explained that she was there to help the emperor conquer the darkness. The emperor asked her to clarify what she meant, and the girl explained that some natives of Salsam, including herself, possessed a unique gift. She said she could see and manipulate magic, which was why she saw the emperor wandering in the darkness in her dream, trapped and unable to escape. Sharon hastened to insist she wasn't a witch, to which the emperor snapped that he didn't care who she was, as long as she got the job done. Julian ordered her to begin her spell, promising that if she succeeded, she and her brother would live. When the slave girl heard the chance to save herself and her brother, she immediately sprang into action. She grabbed the first thing she could find, and the emperor scoffed, pointing out that she dared to rummage so boldly in his private chambers. Sharon apologized for her presumption and explained that she thought there might be something suspicious hidden in the nightstand. She found a small figurine with its limbs bound by rope and explained that someone had tried to kill the emperor using magic. She added that this kind of death would be slow and painful, and Julian couldn't believe Albert had broken into his chambers. Sharon assured him she would deal with the figurine, and the emperor asked if burning it would work. She told him that when the target is discovered, black magic reverses. She clarified that if a spell is cast, the effects will only apply to the original target, and now the target has shifted. Sharon held the figurine over a candle and concluded that the spellcaster would now suffer a series of burns. Julian was impressed that the girl had pinpointed the problem as soon as she entered the room. Sharon muttered smugly that one crisis had been dealt with, and now, late at night, the emperor needed his beauty sleep. As Emperor Julian drifted off to sleep, he kept a sword by his side, a clear sign of his lack of trust. Charles asked His Majesty if he had ever played the word game before, wondering if it might be another way to help him sleep. The slave girl cheerfully suggested they give it a try. Julian thought it foolish of her to risk her life for a joke. Charles announced that she should go first and said the first word, but the emperor remained silent. The girl asked if she was supposed to do all the work herself. Then Julian muttered a word beginning with the last letter of her first word. They played for a while, and Charles was stressed out by how bloody and violent each word chosen by His Majesty sounded. But His Majesty seemed to approve, finally showing a cautious smile. The emperor grew quiet, not responding to the slave girl's next word. Charlotte told him to take his time and think about it. When His Majesty finally fell asleep, Charlotte held her glowing hand over his face, casting a spell. She was certain that from now on, the emperor would sleep soundly and have good dreams. Charles backed away from the sleeping emperor's bedside, relieved that everything had gone well. She thought she could finally relax. After all, she and Pachan definitely wouldn't be fed to the lions now, and the fellow would be out of jail tomorrow. Julian woke up in the morning and couldn't believe his luck. He had actually fallen asleep. He glanced at the sleeping slave girl, remembering hearing a woman's voice whispering in his ear as he drifted off like evening prayers. His Majesty was stunned that he hadn't even had nightmares and decided to check on the slave girl. The girl woke up at the sound of his approaching footsteps. The emperor smiled and said he had thought of the word he was supposed to say. Sharon was stunned. The emperor proudly announced that she had earned a reward for her excellent performance. Her eyes lit up with joy. Now she realized that nothing in life was more important than sleep. The girl hesitated between requesting her favorite food or freedom, but the emperor had his own version of a reward. He told the slave that from now on, she would serve him at night as his personal maid. Sharon was thrilled at first, but then realized the trust she had gained was beyond expectations. She had used this opportunity to escape punishment, and the conditions of the new role were clearly better, especially for someone of her status. Julian snapped. How dare this slave consider the emperor's proposal and still hesitate to answer? Sharon assured him it was a great honor and reminded him that she was just a lowly pagan slave. She asked if someone like her could stay by His Majesty's side all the time. Julian wondered what the big deal was about taking an ordinary slave as a personal maid. She replied that the Chancellor wouldn't allow such a thing to happen. He wouldn't stand idly by. Julian raged. Does this slave think the emperor needs the Chancellor's approval? She knew it sounded rude and presumptuous. But if the Chancellor found out she was living and working near the emperor, he would immediately expel her from the palace. She explained that the empire was now ruled by the Chancellor, and the emperor had little real power, so she needed a guarantee of safety. Julian agreed, and then asked, "So what is the answer?" Sharon smiled nervously, fearing the emperor would argue and reject the idea. The girl said, "As your personal maid, I will not only stop the summoner, but also conduct a secret investigation." She reminded him that she was a slave, and slaves naturally had many limitations. His Majesty asked if she was hinting at wanting freedom. Sharon knew it was incredibly bold, but for the first time in her life, the emperor needed her so desperately. She wasn't going to let this opportunity slip away. She said, "Someone like me doesn't deserve to be by your Majesty's side." Emperor Julian gave a scornful laugh, and Sharon immediately felt stung. Was he mocking her? Then Julian stepped closer and said, Even if I am the dazzling sun, a nameless slave like you still has to work for me, right? At this point, Sharon wondered if this was a normal conversation, but why did she now sense the Emperor's dark aura? Colin rushed into his master's office and asked, "How did you sleep last night?" The Emperor joked, "You always run to me like a puppy, so your visit is no surprise." The red-haired man didn't even flinch, replying, "Dogs have an instinct for strange scents." He asked, "Hey brother, for old time's sake, what happened last night? How did that slave knock you out?" Julian said he hadn't slept so well in a long time. Colin noticed his master looked much better and begged for more details. The Emperor asked, "How did you find out the slave was a girl?" The red-haired man said it was pure luck. He explained that he thought the slave being interrogated might be hiding something. So he peeked into the bathhouse and saw a woman's silhouette. His Majesty clarified, asking if the attendant meant to say he saw his slave girl with his own eyes. The boy replied that the maids had covered the important parts. Then he asked why His Majesty was claiming the slave girl as his own. The Emperor didn't answer, telling Colin to stop babbling. He ordered him to go to the training grounds, check the condition and quality of the weapons and armor, and supervise the training of the war horses. The Emperor added with a smirk, also check the soldiers' naked bodies. Colin exclaimed that this was disgusting. Julian said to inspect the soldiers' bodies from head to toe, looking for wounds, bruises, rot under their fingernails, or hemorrhoids. His Majesty said that this was the duty of an officer who cared for his subordinates. Colin asked if he had messed up. His Majesty retorted that he just wanted his attendant to become a caring and attentive leader. Just then, the red-haired man remembered how furious the Emperor had been when he heard that his slave girl had been seen naked. He finally understood the meaning behind these orders, recalled his lord's tough character, and decided to beg for forgiveness. Meanwhile, the maids finished dressing Sharon and began whispering amongst themselves, admiring the result. Catherine commented that it looked pretty good, just a little too masculine. One maid whispered to her friend that the girl now looked like a foreign noblewoman. Catherine said it was time to see Emperor Julian, and they couldn't keep him waiting. On the way, she told Sharon that only one person in the world could reveal her true nature. She explained that if the Emperor said a stone was a pearl, then by tomorrow it would become a pearl, just like this slave girl now. The woman warned Sharon to be endlessly grateful and not dare to take her eyes off His Majesty. Catherine knocked on the door of His Majesty's chambers and told him she had brought a new servant. When Sharon entered the Emperor's room, he frowned, scowling at the clothes from the Southern Sea Islands. The Emperor ordered the girl to come closer and pointed to the paper in his hand. The young man said that these were the shackles of his future servant, then held the document to a burning candle. The girl was shocked as the Emperor burned the paper with his own hand. The document proving her slave status was burned. He declared that from now on, Sharon was no longer a lowly slave and had every right to be by his side every day. Tears of joy welled up in her eyes, grateful to His Majesty. Now she could go home and really work. But her joy vanished when His Majesty handed her another contract. The contract stated that her service would end when his incurable disease was cured and a new empress was found. The girl was furious. This was insane. After all, who knew if that would ever happen? This contract was no different from a slave contract. The Emperor calmly told her that the document needed a seal at the bottom. Sharon said she didn't have one on her. His Majesty drew his sword, smirking, and said that her blood would suffice. He grabbed her hand and pulled her towards him, but Sharon resisted with all her might. The struggle ended when she twisted her ankle and fell head first onto the Emperor's chest. The moment Sharon realized she was lying on His Majesty's chest, she immediately jumped back as if she had touched a hot stove. She begged for forgiveness, but he just glanced at her awkwardly and then abruptly turned away. Sharon was shocked by such a reaction. Everyone knew that the Emperor had had 2 wives, both of whom died young. She looked at His Majesty, thinking that he didn't look like the invincible demon on horseback at all. She said, "If Your Majesty needs a seal so badly, I can just draw something at the bottom of the document." Julian replied that no, nothing was needed, and beckoned her to sit beside him. Sharon started babbling about how she'd heard the stewards paid anyone working in the palace 100 krone a week. The young man muttered coldly, "As my personal maid, I'll pay you 1,000 krone a month." The emperor raised an eyebrow. Not enough. Sharon asked where she should put the seal. He said no seal was needed, a blood oath was enough. In the East, they mix each other's blood and wine. It signifies your loyalty to your lord, and he, in turn, swears to trust and protect his people. Sharon asked, "Are you sure you want to make a blood oath with me and pay me 1,000 kron a month?" He declared that even though she was once a slave, she possessed magic, and he valued her and would pay her a fair wage. Sharon thought to herself, "I thought he was just toying with me, but he's actually giving me what I deserve." She considered the emperor appearing in her dreams an oracle. Julian deliberately cut himself with his sword and then ran his bloody finger across the contract. Then he showed her another document, insisting it was for safety to ensure she could focus on her work. Sharon's heart sank when she realized the emperor was holding Pachon's slave contract. Julian made it clear that if the maid slacked off or tried to betray him, he would kill her friend. A month later, Sharon mentally took stock of her progress. She had diligently trained in court etiquette and ensured the emperor's sleep was undisturbed. She kept wondering why, even though Pacon was so close, she still couldn't see him. The last time Sharon tried to visit her brother, the steward scolded her harshly. The gist of it was that, as His Majesty's exclusive maid, she couldn't leave the main palace without explicit permission. But Sharon missed Pachon terribly. Unable to bear it any longer, she rushed straight to the emperor. She went to ask for his permission. When they first met, the emperor seemed like an ordinary person, not the cold-blooded demon she'd imagined. She was heading towards His Majesty's chambers when she heard a commotion outside. Without even knocking, she burst in. The room was in chaos. The emperor was on the floor, clutching his head. She realized he was being cursed. He was struggling in pain, so she rushed forward to help him. His hand flung her aside, and in an instant, the rest of his body seemed to be swallowed by darkness. She yelled for him to wake up, calling out her name to him, but it was no use. He grabbed her throat. She realized that pleading with the emperor to come to his senses was futile. He had completely lost control. The question flashed through Sharon's mind. Were the rumors about the bloodthirsty emperor true? At that moment, he slammed her to the ground. She felt it was all the Black Ring's fault. She tried to pull it off, but the emperor's strength was far greater. He kept choking her, and she realized that if this continued, she would lose consciousness. With the last of her strength, she reached for her tormentor's face, and suddenly, a burst of magical light poured from her palm. It worked. Emperor Julian finally came to his senses. He saw Sharon lying on the floor, her neck covered in bruises. He ran his hand over his scarred skin, muttering that he'd lost control again and almost killed his maid. Sharon noticed that even while apologizing for his actions, the emperor seemed so vulnerable once more. Sharon found burn marks on herself, as if she had been scorched by fire, followed by a sharp pain in her chest. She felt as if her insides were being torn apart by rage, deep loathing, and the feeling of betrayal by someone she trusted. She couldn't understand whose emotions these were, nor why someone always looked so sad in her dreams every night. Sharon's eyes snapped open to the emperor's worried face, realizing she had just witnessed his nightmare. She wondered if the emperor endured such pain every night, and if the person who left the doll was the one who cast the curse. The emperor said they had to tighten security. Sharon apologized for letting her guard down after disposing of the doll. The emperor replied that if it were that simple, Chancellor Albert wouldn't have left the palace. He recalled how Prime Minister Albert had begged him to be obedient and take his medicine on time, and how he had lost his temper once again. Sharon touched her neck and asked the emperor this loss of control. It wasn't the first time, was it? Is that how the previous empress died? He scoffed. You're scared. She nodded, stating sharply, I need to know the truth. The emperor sighed impatiently. I don't want to repeat myself. I didn't kill my wife. Aside from the wedding, I barely saw her. A month later, somehow, everyone was whispering that the emperor had gone mad and slaughtered his wife and her maids. Sharon thought that someone as powerful as Chancellor Albert could very well be trying to overthrow the emperor. He asked, why didn't you run when the attack happened? She replied, I am your majesty's maid and a shaman. She reminded him, I swore an oath in blood to be eternally loyal as your servant. I must trust and protect my master. The emperor was stunned. How could a maid who had only served him for a month say such a thing? Meanwhile, she fell in a deep thought, realizing this couldn't go on. She had tracked down and destroyed the cursed doll, but it hadn't done anything. The real culprit never showed themselves. The mastermind was likely messing with the emperor's mind and probably got rid of his other attendants with the same trick. Sharon asked the emperor to wait for her for a few minutes. Then, after today's disaster, began racking her brain for a solution to this mess. She knew he was a walking weapon right now, but lifting the curse was beyond her abilities. Magic was too risky anyway. Finally, she found a suitable door. A side chamber used by servants would do just fine. The girl announced that, from today onwards, she would stay by his side every night, guarding his sleep. She explained that she could stay in the side chamber, but the Emperor said it wasn't necessary. It was all over now. He told her to knock him unconscious and leave, but Sharon countered that it was just a temporary fix and wouldn't protect him. She explained that since the incidents were magic-related, they needed to fight back with magic. His Majesty was dumbfounded that this servant was worried about protecting him after he'd nearly strangled her. Sharon said she would endure it, just like today. Julian scoffed, thinking she was just putting on a brave face. He asked if she would still rush in if he had a sword. Sharon shrieked that she would do it without hesitation. Emperor Julian retorted, asking why this servant dared to talk back to him. When things calmed down, Sharon calmly announced she had a foolproof plan. She solemnly declared to the Emperor that they would perform a soul binding, a union of minds and bodies. His Majesty, bewildered and his face etched with confusion, asked what the point was. Sharon stammered, explaining that this union would help track the source of the magic. The Emperor pleaded with her not to pounce on him. The girl babbled, insisting she didn't mean it in that vulgar way, not in the sense of romantic entanglement. He told her not to over-explain. Sharon snapped that he'd clearly misunderstood. She retorted, asking how a girl like her could possibly covet the Emperor, especially since he wasn't even a real man. The Emperor's face darkened. "What does that mean?" he asked. Sharon replied that she was referring to a unique protective magic. His Majesty pointed out that wasn't what he'd asked. It was then that the girl realized he was referring to her earlier remark. She said she'd actually suggested a rather good idea, but Julian's face twisted into another grimace of annoyance. He clicked his tongue impatiently. "Don't you remember saying the Emperor isn't a man?" he reminded the handmaid. Sharon asked, "Does it really matter now?" while internally struggling not to say something she'd regret later. She explained that she meant His Majesty wasn't a regular man, but the son of the great Baldic Empire. She launched into a stream of flattering praises towards the monarch, but he just sighed, murmuring, "You have a silver tongue, handmaid." He added, "It sounds strange, as if you'd gladly hold any commoner in your heart, anyone but the Emperor." She replied that she didn't intend to let anyone into her heart anyway. She already had Pachon in her heart. Emperor Julian beamed, exclaiming, "That's wonderful news." Sharon blinked in surprise. Then she announced that she would explain the protective magic that could unite their minds and bodies. She said His Majesty needed to drip his blood onto a brand new silk thread before going to sleep. The Emperor was to tie the thread around his ankle. Sharon explained that she would do the same with another thread. She claimed the effects wouldn't be immediate, but with persistent use, it would eventually work. She clarified that they needed to stay in the same room. There's a vacant servant's chamber in these sleeping quarters. For some reason, Julian didn't like the idea of a servant bearing the risk. He asked if he understood correctly that she wanted to transfer the cursed object. The girl cheerfully confirmed this, stating that if she took the curse upon herself, she could dispel it and heal the Emperor. The Emperor countered that he might not know much about magic, but he figured it was dangerous for the servant. At this moment, Sharon recalled how magic could destroy your body, depending on its type and intensity. But His Majesty's curse wasn't life-threatening, more like brainwashing. Plus, since His Majesty had no heir, killing a direct royal descendant wouldn't benefit the caster. Sharon had the Emperor clench his fist and asked if he understood that controlling the fist like this was safer. She said that, firstly, if she got into trouble, Emperor Julian would take care of her. Just like today, His Majesty commented, noting that for a personal handmaid, she certainly had a sharp tongue. He then reminded her that they wouldn't be loyal to Sharon unless they saw some benefit. The girl told him not to worry, and suddenly realized this was the perfect time to ask a question. She asked if she could leave the palace for a while, since she'd been learning etiquette and helping the Emperor sleep for the past month. His Majesty agreed, but warned her not to tell anyone she was once a stable boy. She thought to herself that her colleagues would probably guess anyway, but kept it to herself. Then she promised to return quickly. Headmaid Catherine watched the Emperor's handmaid dash off, the clicking of her heels crackling like firecrackers. She decided to head to His Majesty's chambers to inform him that Chancellor Albert had arranged a banquet for tomorrow evening. She added that all the nobles from the secret meeting would be present, and Princess Stuart would be introduced. The emperor pointed out that she already bore Albert's surname and quipped that the chancellor no longer had any unmarried daughters. Catherine mused that even without children, Albert could create one to suit his needs. She mentioned that Stuart had joined the Duke's family 3 years ago and received an education fit for an empress. Julian scoffed, "We lost our second empress 3 years ago, and you're already scouting for a third." Catherine said it would be strange to give the empress's position to another family. His Majesty shrugged. "No choice. 2 top families have already offered their daughters." Julian snapped. Now Albert can just shove his daughter into that position. He added, "It's empty anyway. If this happens, I'll be completely isolated." Catherine warned, "Your Highness, you cannot defy the Chancellor's will." He said, "I won't back down. Have Sharon prepare for tomorrow's banquet." He added, "This move has to be right. I can't wait to see Albert's next move." He asked, "Have you taken care of Sharon's background?" "It's handled." She said, "All the old staff are gone. She hasn't set foot in the palace for the past 3 years. If you know her story, which might not be enough, Albert might already be investigating." The emperor declared with a satisfied smile that it would do. Then Catherine casually asked where he'd sent Sharon. The lady pointed out that the emperor should rest. He replied that the handmaid had gone outside the palace for a short break. Catherine sighed irritably, muttering that the handmaid had run off to see that man again. His Majesty asked if Sharon had really gone to see that person, and Catherine said she had warned her repeatedly to be careful. She concluded that Sharon had ignored the warning and gone to see the man, who was already dead. Meanwhile, the girl burst through the door, exclaiming, "I finally made it to Pachon's place." But the dormitory was empty. She found it strange. He was supposed to be here. She made a mental note that she hadn't run into any of her old colleagues on the way. Then a stranger asked her who she was and why she was there. She turned around and saw an ordinary worker, definitely not a slave. She asked, "Where did everyone else go?" The man said all the employees here had been sent to a labor camp. He added that he didn't know what great wrong they had committed to end up in the mines. They worked there until death, beaten every day. Sharon couldn't understand why Pachon would end up like this. Then it suddenly occurred to her that all pagan slaves belonged to His Majesty. She wondered if the emperor had done this to her brother, and then remembered her master had threatened to kill a slave. She trembled with fear. She had always done her job well and never betrayed the emperor. She felt that this must be a misunderstanding. His Majesty wouldn't do this without warning her first. The girl believed the emperor was a man of his word, and he had even taken the time to show concern for her. Today, as she left the empty dormitory, Sharon decided that, as his exclusive handmaid, she must have complete trust in her master. She remembered their first meeting, when he had mistaken her for a man and asked why she was sneaking around like a rat. Then, she recalled the emperor ordering a lion to be sent to her friend Pachan and telling her his life depended on the captured man's testimony. She didn't know what her faith was based on anymore. Before this, she had felt endless happiness. She had finally escaped slavery and was enjoying a salary of 1,000 gold coins a month. She collapsed to the ground, sobbing, berating herself for not ensuring Pachon's safety first and only focusing on enjoying her new position. Sharon and Pachon had been inseparable since childhood, and it felt like they would always be together. No one expected anything to happen to him. She blamed herself, praying for Pachon's forgiveness in her heart and trying to figure out what to do next. Suddenly, a man's voice called her name from behind. She turned and saw Emperor Julian. He glared at her and ordered her to stand up. This was outrageous. She looked at the emperor and asked, "It was all a lie, wasn't it? You didn't kill Pachon." But the answer was unexpected. His Majesty said she was not only greedy but also audacious, and then ordered her to follow him. He led her to the main training grounds, saying it was close to the main palace. Sharon said she knew the place because she had cleaned there once. The emperor told her to look down. The girl saw her fellow countrymen safe and sound. His Majesty pointed out that they were his gladiators. Julian added that it didn't matter who they were because with a single command, they would eliminate anyone by any means necessary. Sharon asked if her fellow countrymen would receive the same treatment, and the emperor agreed. The girl glanced at the man again with concern, but there was no need to worry. Pachon didn't feel slighted and held his own among the other trained gladiators. The girl realized the labor camp was a ruse, and he had actually set up this situation for Pachon. Sharon was deeply moved by her master's noble act and thanked him from the bottom of her heart. Suddenly, he ran his hand behind her ear. Sharon felt a wave of unease, goosebumps rising on her skin. The Emperor remembered that, in desperation, he had given the slave a chance. He needed to survive in this cursed palace. Later, Catherine spoke with His Majesty, promising to watch the slave at night to see if she would really help him. It was a precarious plan, but worked until one day, the housekeeper expressed concern about the Emperor spending every night with the handmaid. Emperor Julian laughed and asked Catherine if she really thought her master would be so easily swayed by beauty. She said, "Not at all. I just don't want anyone to break his heart." He remembered Sharon shouting that she was His Majesty's handmaid and had sworn on oddity, so she believed he would protect her. Another memory surfaced of the handmaid, tearful, insisting that her master didn't always have to win. He also remembered the handmaid's mantra. She had yelled at him, "No sleeping at sunset." But then, Catherine dropped a bombshell. That was long before they entered the imperial palace. The man had been close to Sharon. Julian had long decided that words like affection and love were meaningless, nothing but garbage in the mind. He knew it was pointless to be infatuated with someone who already had her heart set on another, even if everything about her belonged to him. His Majesty said, "Don't thank me. This is just my way of managing a slave." Sharon noticed something was off about her master. He added, "You don't have to thank me for taking care of what already belongs to me. Vice versa, so you, as a servant, had better remember your place." He warned her never to forget who was in charge, reminding her that anything she desired, he could take away just as easily. After Emperor Julian left, the girl pondered whether this meant she needed to focus more on the contract. She missed her brother, feeling she had shown weakness in the Emperor's eyes. But how could His Majesty understand her feelings? Sharon thought that perhaps a lowly slave could never understand the thoughts of noblemen. Now she understood the head maid's words. Serving the Emperor required not only diligence, but also careful observation and anticipation of his needs. Sharon decided that if she wanted to remain in the palace, it was best to conceal her true emotions. Lost in thought about her next move, she noticed the training room was stiflingly hot, like a sauna, the air thick and stagnant. Just then, Pachon strode in, calling her name, and she rushed into his arms, babbling incoherently. "I'm so glad to see you," he replied. "At first, I thought the goddess Alsam had blessed me, but it's just Sharon." Sharon told him to look at her. He seemed taller, his shoulders broader. Pachan blushed shyly. Looking at him, the girl thought the gladiator's life suited him. He hadn't smiled so brightly in a long time. The boy asked her where she had been. He had been worried. Sharon solemnly announced that she had become the Emperor's personal attendant, responsible for treating His Majesty's insomnia and warding off black magic. She declared she was earning 1,000 krona a month. Hearing this figure, the boy's eyes widened in shock. Sharon explained that once His Majesty's illness was cured and he found a wife, she could leave this position. She told Pachon to wait a little longer. He smiled and said he liked this life. He said the Emperor's lion, surprisingly well trained, had run off as soon as its master appeared. Pachon admitted he had initial doubts about the job, but was now incredibly grateful to the Emperor. He vowed to give his all, to live up to the Emperor's trust and become a top gladiator. The girl looked at her brother, thinking how passionate he was inside, though he rarely showed it, always pretending everything was fine. Sharon was happy their relationship had finally improved. They had lived in squalor for 3 years, and now finally had hope. The girl asked Pachon if he wasn't worried about her being with the Emperor every day. Pachon replied that he trusted her more than himself, but worried she might hurt someone with her magic on a whim. Hearing this, Sharon's heart melted. She said no man in the world could believe in her and love her so steadfastly. Pachon asked if she remembered their promise to marry upon returning to their island. She said that now they both worked for His Majesty. She could eventually ask the Emperor for permission to marry Pachon. He immediately declared he would always support Sharon. She replied that she would always support him too. That night, she went to the Emperor's chambers, thinking that his words, though harsh, were honest. Sharon knew that until she proved her worth, she appeared weak. But first, she had to accept that she was no longer a slave. She told herself that from now on, she was a loyal servant, her master's safety her sole concern. She strode into the Emperor's private chambers and announced she had brought the medicine for his insomnia. Julian looked at the cup suspiciously. "Are you sure this is medicine? It looks like muddy water." Sharon relished this moment. The Emperor was right. It did look disgusting, but she wasn't backing down. She inwardly raged at the threats, the suffocating tension, the secret of Pachon, and the hand that had stroked her hair. She smiled triumphantly, her face expressionless. The taste may be unpleasant, as it contains many potent herbs. Bitter, the emperor choked down the last mouthful. Fine, whatever. She grinned. They say good medicine tastes bitter. She admitted, I added a few extra bitter herbs. The emperor rubbed his forehead. You're a little rascal. Sharon produced the yarn Catherine had lent her, ready to begin the protective spell. Sharon tied one end of the yarn to the emperor's wrist and the other around her own ankle. Then she told his majesty not to move. He was about to cast a spell when the girl began whispering to the yarn. Julian suddenly wanted to grab her, but a second later his hand dropped. The young man calmed down, a peaceful smile gracing his lips as he fell into a deep sleep. Meanwhile, Chancellor Albert Stewart was deep in thought, his mind solely on tomorrow's banquet. He asked the girl if she had received the dress, and she replied, yes. He added, you will outshine everyone at this banquet. Albert recalled how, during the war, Julian had fled the battlefield, only to return with an army. He wondered if anything had changed. Would the emperor now grovel at his feet like a servant, or would he simply disappear? The man said that this time they would finally get rid of him, as long as the girl didn't mess up. She meekly agreed and bowed to her father. The next day, His Majesty dressed in festive attire for the banquet. Colin noticed His Majesty looked breathtaking, then snapped at his subordinate. Stop staring, it's disgusting. The red-haired man, Colin, reminded him, I've watched over your majesty since childhood with reverence and admiration. Julian scoffed, that's preposterous. His aide added, you've changed ever since that new maid arrived. The man pointed out, not long ago, your majesty looked like a demon hunting for heads, but now you have some life in you. He speculated, it's like this when you're close to a woman. You're unstoppable when you're with the opposite sex. Julian sighed irritably. His subordinate clearly didn't understand the true nature of his relationship with Sharon. What they did at night was completely different from what Colin imagined. The emperor thought that if he revealed the truth now, his aide would laugh at him for years, and he didn't want to kill him for that. Julian grumbled, wishing his aide was as good at following orders and inspecting soldiers' naked bodies as he was at running his mouth. Colin said he'd heard Miss Stewart would be attending the banquet and hoped she looked like her father. Julian replied that there was little information about her and wondered what Albert's spies were up to. Meanwhile, the man pretended not to hear, his mind racing. Could the secret plan he'd received earlier have something to do with the princess? Colin told His Majesty that Albert seemed to be trying to cover up the lowliness of his illegitimate daughter status. The emperor retorted that no matter how he tried to hide it, he couldn't avoid the rumors. Albert adopting the girl might just be a way to use her. Colin asked, do you really intend to marry the princess? She could bear you a son, and then Albert could put his grandson on the throne, thereby seizing power. Julian scoffed. Did he think his aide hadn't figured that out? The red-haired man thought to himself that he had never doubted His Majesty. No, he had always been in awe of His Majesty's wisdom and power. Once, after crushing a horde of spider monsters, Colin asked His Majesty how he had chosen that tactic. He thought burning everything around to clear the webs was a stroke of genius, then driving them all in one direction and annihilating them. The emperor said he'd learned it from the chancellor. At the banquet, the guests whispered about how amazing it all seemed. Clearly, the chancellor had put a lot of thought into it. Some said the banquet was being held for the emperor, who had been on the front lines, while others countered that his days there hadn't been so bad. No one knew if he'd return to normal after seeing that monster. Some even wondered if he'd have a mental breakdown. Today, someone warned to be careful, as it was said a lady had a scar on her face after seeing the emperor. Some claimed they wished the old emperor could have another child. Suddenly, a voice in the hall called for silence. His Majesty, Emperor Julian Badok, had arrived. The guests stared at the emperor's knights, whispering, is this the mighty force everyone's been talking about? Another question arose. Was the emperor really that clumsy, breathless child who looked like a useless puppet? Many asked who that tall, arrogant fellow striding with such confidence was. They saw a completely different person in Emperor Julian, unable to imagine what he had gone through in the past 3 years. A silver-haired old man strode in, walked up to the emperor, and knelt on one knee, bowing to him. He announced, "Your Majesty, your loyal servant, the Chancellor, has arrived." Sharon gazed at herself in the mirror, murmuring, "Isn't this Tufi Huali, gorgeous/magnificent, too revealing for an ordinary servant?" The head maid, Catherine, urged her to hurry. She had to play the Emperor's wife at the banquet. Sharon retorted, "Wasn't I here to serve His Majesty, not to play his girlfriend?" Catherine straightened up and said, "At this banquet, the maid will play the Emperor's most beloved woman." She stated, "We need to curb the forces that threaten His Majesty's position." Sharon asked if the head maid really wanted a servant to go up against the nobles now. She pointed out that she had only arrived at the palace a month ago, and Catherine assured her there was nothing to worry about. She claimed she only had one task. The Emperor had been falsely accused of murdering his wives, and the nobles believed he hated women. They thought he was still resentful of his mother abandoning him, and that this child had gained power solely due to his blood relation to the Emperor. The nobles believed this mad emperor, who brandished his sword at the sight of a woman, was unfit for the throne. Everyone thought Albert was taking care of the emperor, but he had actually been abusing the child. But no one knew this. If his daughter became empress, all the power would eventually fall into the chancellor's hands. Catherine was afraid. Until the new empress became pregnant, the emperor was just a useful tool. She told Sharon to show the world that the emperor had pulled himself together and no longer shied away from women. Sharon had to act like she was that special someone, the one irreplaceable woman in His Majesty's life. At the banquet, the emperor was making small talk, basking in everyone's joy at his safe return from the war. Now that peace had come, it was time to enjoy some favorite hobbies, like seasonal deer hunting. Albert answered for Julian, thinking he was busy training gladiators. The emperor countered that it was just a game. His soldiers were still wet behind the ears, while the chancellor's gladiators were world-renowned. His Majesty heard the rumor that Albert was assembling an army rivaling the empire's. The chancellor suggested a friendly gladiatorial match to compare their strengths, boasting that Albert's children would surely teach the emperor's men a lesson. The crowd murmured, discussing how the chancellor addressed His Majesty as an equal, disrespectful, and arrogant. Some pointed out that even fathers and sons wouldn't be so casual, and since Albert was so protective of the emperor, he had nothing to worry about. Suddenly, they announced the arrival of Princess Diana Stuart, Duke Albert's daughter. The clicking of her heels echoed, and the hall's atmosphere instantly tightened. The girl looked exactly like the former empress. Colin even thought it was her for a moment. Princess Diana wore the late empress's favorite dress. The chancellor's daughter, the future mistress of the palace, bowed to the emperor, addressing him as the radiant son of the empire. She told herself everything was going perfectly. Her father's orders were followed. The nobles were on her side. She smiled triumphantly. Now she only needed to take the empty seat beside His Majesty. However, what happened next left her dumbfounded. Julian didn't take the princess's hand. Instead, he knocked over his wine glass, spilling red wine all over the chair. He claimed it was a slip of the hand, an accident, and then ordered the now-stained chair to be removed. The banquet guests whispered amongst themselves, "Shouldn't the princess, as the next empress, sit beside the emperor?" But someone shushed them, reminding them the chancellor's spies were everywhere, and the situation was already awkward enough. Meanwhile, the chancellor was furious. His child had messed up, and now Julian had the perfect excuse to bring him down. Someone changed the subject, saying they'd heard a rumor, but didn't believe it, so they wanted to ask the emperor directly. He brought up the gossip about His Majesty keeping a slave girl as a servant. The emperor asked if this was against the rules. Albert retorted that the son of the empire could do as he pleased. He clarified that it could ruin the emperor's reputation. How could someone who used to shovel manure mingle with the ruler? The nobles started murmuring again, imploring the emperor to reconsider. The empire's reputation couldn't be tarnished. They shrieked that a common slave should never be allowed near the throne. Someone muttered that he was still mad, having killed all his empresses, and now he'd brought in a slave. Another guessed the emperor was trying to avoid marrying the chancellor's daughter. Yet another thought he was young and hot-headed, and if provoked, he would unleash his wrath. Julian raised an eyebrow. Why the sudden silence? Did you think I came here to listen to your commands? The noble retorted sharply, absolutely not. The atmosphere in the room instantly plummeted. The chancellor pulled the princess forward. He declared, "The war is over, and the emperor needs to choose an heir. I always offer the best to His Majesty. He shouldn't defile his noble body." Julian frowned. "Albert, let's talk." "Colin, read the document. The red-haired man announced that Miss Stewart would stay in the palace for 100 days to assess her suitability as empress. The chancellor was stunned. This emperor was no longer the agreeable, obedient, and compliant child. He said he would eagerly await his majesty's decision, but he still had a question about the slave girl. Just then, a woman's voice echoed through the banquet hall. She greeted his majesty and announced her arrival. Everyone turned their heads in astonishment. Who was she? Why was she dressed so inappropriately? Some immediately recognized her, the lazy maid. Only a heathen slave would dare wear such clothes. Sharon realized she had never learned to face fear, nor to look a noble in the eye. Then she remembered the head maid's advice. Think of the nobles as horses. She did just that, shaking off her shyness and rushing straight into the emperor's arms. She spoke softly, complaining about his majesty leaving her alone. Sharon added that he needn't be nervous anymore. His beloved had arrived and was right here. The hall buzzed with whispers, some confused as to why the emperor hadn't gone mad. The woman had just thrown herself at him. Someone muttered that the girl was a stunning beauty, definitely not a commoner. Perhaps she hailed from a noble family on the island of Salsam. Coupled with the fact that the emperor wasn't even angry, he was either mad or she was true nobility. The chancellor looked utterly shocked, unable to comprehend the situation. The princess didn't even dare look her father in the eye. The chancellor couldn't understand how a slave who was shoveling manure in the stables yesterday was now so close to the emperor. He wondered if her gaze was too arrogant, considering she was recently just trash beneath the noble's feet. He sensed a strange aura about her, and thought this was why his curse on the emperor hadn't worked. The chancellor decided to eliminate her before she became a real obstacle. He said he was amazed to see her rise to prominence. He remarked that the emperor had found an uncut gem in the stables and, with a little polishing, turned it into a diamond. Julian retorted that the chancellor, as always, couldn't hide his motives and always pretended to be like the emperor. His Majesty asked Albert, "Haven't they taught you that even a stone, when properly honed, can become a weapon?" Albert retorted that if he didn't understand how a stone dug from a dung heap could become a pearl, then he must be a very poor student. The emperor replied that he hadn't expected Albert to say that, considering he couldn't even remember in which field he'd sown his seeds. "Are you suggesting that the emperor's eye is worse than his seed?" He countered. Julian thought to Albert, "If you're already fantasizing about sitting on the throne, you'll make many more mistakes in the future." Sharon said she was tired and excused herself. But in her heart, she kept thinking how crazy she'd been to dare sit on the emperor's lap. As she walked out of the banquet hall, she breathed a sigh of relief, thinking it was all over and that she'd performed remarkably well. She was glad the nobles had believed her performance, even though sitting on his lap had looked utterly ridiculous. The emperor must have been stunned, but she was only his personal maid. How could she act arrogant in such a chaotic situation? She realized she didn't belong in this farce and needed to return to her real duties. The chancellor's cruel words still echoed in her ears. A stone picked up from the dirt cannot become a pearl. The chancellor was rumored to have a kind face, but at the banquet, his icy gaze was like a blade, ready to strike at any moment. Many of the nobles at the banquet were the chancellor's supporters, and Sharon could hardly believe she was about to confront him. Now, in the hallway, she overheard Miss Stewart and her maid chatting. Catherine's words were still fresh in her mind. The marriage was still proceeding. On the one hand, she felt terrible, as this union might weaken the emperor's power. But on the other hand, she was thrilled at the prospect of being released from her contract and returning to her island. The princess seemed far less malicious than the chancellor. Diana had to marry the emperor for her to return home, Sharon thought. At the banquet, Miss Stewart had looked gloomy, probably believing the rumors about the emperor's mistress. Sharon prayed the princess wouldn't back out of the wedding at the last minute. She wanted to explain everything, but the plan had to remain secret. She intended only to greet her, not divulge any secrets. Her future husband would handle the details. As Sharon introduced herself to Miss Stewart, the maid slapped her, scolding her to know her place. She stared at Miss Stewart's calm face, unwilling to believe this angelic figure had given the order. Sharon thought Miss Stewart was so composed because she had no idea she'd stepped into the heart of hell. Sharon said she understood the princess's anger. The maid, Miss Eaton, lost her composure. How dare you talk back? She raised her hand to strike again, but the princess stopped her. This servant dared to speak to her mistress that way. The maid hissed. Sharon was astonished. Was that really enough reason to hit her? Her Highness told Miss Eaton to calm down. After all, the poor servant probably didn't know court etiquette. Diana asked if the maid was truly from Sersum Island, and Sharon confirmed it. Then, Diana asked curiously, do all the locals dress as improperly as this maid? Her appearance at the banquet is like she's wrapped in a bath towel. Sharon replied that the princess simply didn't understand the island. The climate there was very hot, so their clothes were made of light fabrics. I see, the girl explained. The light fabric helped their skin breathe freely. Her Highness scoffed. Listening to her, you'd think everyone there walks around half-naked like prostitutes. Sharon felt the young lady's disdain was palpable. The people of the Empire simply didn't understand the cultural significance of traditional Sersum clothing, she thought. She couldn't comprehend how someone who would one day be the empress of the entire nation could denigrate another country like that. Sharon silently felt sorry for the emperor, who would spend the rest of his life with such a life partner. She addressed the princess as Miss, but her Highness flew into a rage, snapping, I am the empress, not some commoner you can insult with nicknames. Sharon noticed the princess was much more astute than she appeared. It seems you overestimate me, she retorted. The princess said to her, you seemed quite composed when you were sitting on the emperor's lap, looking up at me. She added, His Majesty held her very gently, making sure she wouldn't fall from his lap. These words made Diana's face contort with anger. When Sharon mentioned that the Empire would be eternally grateful for the humility the young lady had shown at the banquet, the princess's fury reached its peak. The governess flew into a rage again and raised her hand to strike Sharon, when a woman's voice echoed in the hallway. The head maid, flanked by 2 guards, demanded to know what the commotion was about. She ordered them to seize the red-haired girl who caused the disturbance. But Miss Diana objected, saying this was her personal maid. The knights didn't stop. The young lady then ordered them to stand down in the name of the empress. Catherine retorted that the princess was not yet the empress, merely a guest in this hall, and it was too early to start ordering people around. Miss Diana reminded her that she was the chancellor's daughter and soon-to-be empress, so the maid should fear the consequences. Catherine pointed out that she knew Miss Stewart had received imperial training, but apparently, the chancellor had overestimated his daughter. She remarked casually that this short time wasn't enough to grasp the basics of imperial etiquette, then strode towards Sharon. She declared, striking the empress's personal maid is an act of treason. Catherine made it clear the maid should be hanged, then walked up to Sharon and asked, Are you badly hurt? Sharon, stunned, still managed to reply, I think I bit my cheek. My mouth is full of blood, and my gums still hurt. She added that her teeth were starting to ache as well. The princess and Miss Eaton's eyes widened in fear. Catherine announced that this was a grave offense. The red-haired girl burst into tears, begging her mistress to do something. But Princess Diana could do nothing but stand there in silence. Catherine ordered her locked up until the emperor himself decided on her punishment. On the way to the emperor's chambers, Sharon wondered if they would really execute the girl. Catherine told her not to dwell on it, but Sharon was still anxious. Yes, she was angry, but killing someone for a slap was excessive. Sharon finally understood why being a personal maid was so important. When she was a slave, they would whip her. When the girl was granted entry, she flung open the door to the emperor's chambers and froze. The emperor was unbuttoning his coat and shirt. He was about to change. He told the maid to wait a moment. She offered to help, but he refused. There was no awkwardness between them. Both Sharon and the emperor were used to being undressed in each other's presence. The emperor asked her how she'd injured her cheek. In that instant, anger surged through Sharon. She remembered someone recently calling her a lowly slave who cleaned up horse dung, and she quickly formulated an answer for the emperor. She told him she had tripped and fallen in her haste. Her logic was, the emperor was also a noble. He would take the same stance as Miss Stewart and never let some conflict delay the royal wedding. But as the emperor's maid, these words stung. She asked His Majesty what he thought of Miss Stewart. His Majesty called it a foolish question. It was a political marriage. His feelings were irrelevant. Sharon asked, what if his wife turned out to be a good person? Besides, it might even help cure his insomnia. Sharon thought that maybe then she could end her service and leave without any regrets. The emperor narrowed his eyes at the servant and asked, "What are you talking about?" Sharon said she wasn't implying anything. She was certain the young lady didn't know she was the emperor's fake lover. She added that today's events proved the future empress wasn't someone who would stand idly by. But she worried that if the young lady misunderstood something now, it would cause trouble after she married the emperor. The emperor asked, "What do you intend to do about it?" Sharon said, "I can talk to the princess and explain everything." The young man scoffed, "Why should I explain anything? I'm still single." Sharon said, "I just want you to be happy." The emperor grabbed her throat. "Do you intend to serve me like this for the rest of your life?" He asked coldly. He glared at her. "Why do you claim to be utterly devoted to me, caring only for me, while plotting to elope with that slave?" Her eyes widened in shock. Then she stammered, "Forgive me, master. I misspoke." The next second, the emperor looked away and released her. "You don't need to cast the spell tonight." She was immediately annoyed. "Why?" The emperor was resolute. Sharon stared at the bottle on his nightstand, memories of their last argument flooding back. One day, she had picked up that bottle, sniffed it, and asked, "Sir, isn't this liquor?" He said yes. She replied, "You shouldn't drink that. It might interfere with your medication." She couldn't believe her master was drinking this. The bottle didn't even have a label. The emperor explained that he'd started drinking it after he began fighting the monsters. He said that on the battlefield, after the fighting ended, he had to do something to fall asleep. The maid had smiled and declared that her master wouldn't need to drink it anymore. Since then, the same bottle had remained in the emperor's bedroom, and the protagonist had been blaming herself for speaking out of turn. She regretted saying too much. Perhaps for her master, this marriage was just a tool for power, she mused. Sharon fantasized about what a happy marriage should be. She berated herself for meddling. After all, this was a political marriage arranged by the chancellor. She reminded herself to know her place and not overstep her boundaries, and to remember that she might be leaving this place soon. Someday, the contract with the emperor would end. Pachon would earn his reputation as a gladiator, and then they would elope to Sersum Island together. Suddenly, the daydreaming girl heard a strange noise coming from her master's room. The emperor dreamt he was wandering alone in some lifeless wasteland for days. Exhausted and parched, His Highness heard a woman's voice echo from the sky. "The tyrant's child sits in his mother's womb." He recognized the line, and the next one too. "All his descendants will live lonely and impoverished like this scorched earth." Suddenly, the young man stumbled into a pile of ashes. The voice declared the cursed flames would haunt him forever, just like the witch who was now nothing but dust. His legs, arms, and neck were entangled by something black, tentacled, and slickly writhing. He couldn't breathe, silently praying for it all to stop. Was this curse eternal? The next second, the emperor's hands were free, gripping a dagger. A thought flashed through his mind. He could finally end this torment himself. Suddenly, a bright light enveloped him, and he heard the familiar, gentle voice of his maid, Sharon. She said she would take away all of her master's pain and suffering. The dagger in his hand vanished, and he reached out to his savior, seeing a red string tied around his wrist. Waking up, His Majesty walked over to his personal maid sleeping beside him. The emperor was inwardly furious at Sharon for meddling in his dreams. He stroked her face. Her skin was so soft. It felt like he was standing in the pouring rain, helpless, letting the water soak him to the bone. Late at night, the emperor still sat beside Sharon. He looked at the bruise on the maid's cheek and wondered who had hit her. After all, it was clearly a lie when she said she had just tripped and fallen. He decided to get a report from Head, maid Catherine first before asking Sharon. He suddenly noticed the maid begin to wriggle her legs and toss and turn, presumably her sleeping habit. The blanket almost slipped off, so the emperor tucked her in. He tucked her in, muttering that if his personal maid caught a cold, who would take care of him. The young man thought he was doing this purely out of a monarch's concern for his subordinate. Meanwhile, the Duke, the steward's mansion, was in disarray. The father yelled at his daughter for ignoring his warning about Julian's disdain for their mother. So he always picked plain and modest clothes for the princess. But his stubborn daughter did the opposite, wearing a dress identical to the late empress's and begging for his forgiveness. Diana argued that a man who lost his mother early would harbor deep sorrow for her. She pointed out that she herself had felt the same grief at the age of 17. She added that she wanted to help Julian vent all his pent-up emotions to win his favor. Diana said she would use all means necessary to succeed. The man roared, asking who had put those nonsensical ideas into her head. The girl retorted, "That's not nonsense. I read it in a book. The father chuckled. You believe in fairy tales, do you? Then he said sternly, daughter, human emotions are not as shallow as you think. You can't heal someone just by letting them vent. Trust can turn into distrust in an instant. The father told her to stop being foolish and acting like a child. Reality wasn't a fairy tale. He said the Empress's story hadn't taught her to be cautious, and today she acted like a savage. The man said his reputation had suffered because of the strife she stirred up in the imperial palace. For certain guests, she said she was just incredibly frustrated that His Majesty hadn't paid attention to her. Diana added that as long as her father could deliver the Emperor's heart to her, she could fix everything and make things right. He retorted that if mind control were so easy, the whole world would belong to witches by now. The girl knelt at his feet, begging him not to abandon her, promising not to mess up anything related to the Emperor again. She cried that from now on, she didn't want to go back to those slums. The man said if she truly felt that way, she needed to have a child with Julian so he could live as regent. But even if Diana failed, he wouldn't abandon her. He would just kill her. As he left, he decided to give up hope for his daughter's success. It was time to strengthen the magic, but recently, the magic hadn't worked on the Emperor, most likely because of that slave girl who was always by his side. The Emperor's aide, Collins, cheered the success of the banquet operation. Catherine said not to jump to conclusions too soon. The red-haired fellow addressed the head maid as mother. He argued. The atmosphere of this event was completely different. Just wait and see the shocked expressions on those old nobles' faces. The Emperor said it was all thanks to Sharon. Even the pro-royal faction didn't dare complain. Collins grinned smugly. From now on, everything will change. There will be no more rumors about His Majesty's issues with women. Catherine added, if it were any other woman sitting next to the Emperor, no one would have believed it. She admitted, at first, I seriously doubted that Maid could succeed, but with her looks and magic skills, she exceeded everyone's expectations. His Majesty suddenly asked, who dared to hit my personal maid? The head maid didn't answer, only announcing that she had imprisoned Princess Stuart's maid. The Emperor asked where she came from. Catherine replied, she's the heir of Baron Eaton from the western border, an ambitious fellow who wants to get involved in central politics. Collins added, think what you will, that Baron worked his fingers to the bone to become chancellor. As Catherine chastised her son, the Emperor asked, isn't that the Baron we sent troops to support on the border? Collins nodded. That's the one. The Emperor said, those soldiers, the Celtic barbarians, they fight like beasts. Now I understand why the western border has never been breached. Catherine pointed out that it was no surprise Albion agreed to promote Baron Eaton's daughter. The aide asked, so was it really worth being so rough with her just for a slap? Julian pointed out that his cherished Maid had lost 2 teeth since she was struck. Catherine clarified, weren't her gums also split and bleeding? Collins commented, that's quite the skillful blow. It could even be fatal. A few days later, heavy crashes rocked the Eaton estate, sending dust flying and fences and walls crumbling. The lord of the manor stormed up to the guards, roaring, which imbecile dared to fire upon us? A dumbfounded guard told his lord that the attacker's banner bore a white lion. The baron was equally stunned. Sure enough, the Emperor and his army had amassed outside the estate walls. Meanwhile, back at the palace, Collins complained to Sharon, do I really have to carry this huge chest? She gave him a thumbs up. Thanks for volunteering. He pointed out that it was traditional clothing from the Sursen Islanders, then asked, aren't you going to wear it anymore? Sharon said there was nothing wrong with her clothes, but people in the palace always looked differently at anything culturally distinct. She didn't want the Empire to misunderstand the girls from Sersan. The head maid gave her some ready-made outfits from the palace. Collins narrowed his eyes. What's in the chest, Sharon? The girl said it was a blanket the Emperor had used to cover her, but he'd left at dawn, leaving the blanket behind, and she didn't know what to do with it, so she gave it to the head maid. The redhead said, His Majesty's spring has finally arrived. Sharon blinked in confusion, asking him to explain. Collins said he hadn't seen His Majesty so kind and gentle in a long time. The girl, recalling how His Majesty had treated her like dirt in the past, muttered that their relationship was a mess. She said she couldn't tell which side of the Emperor was the real him, and the man beamed, pleased that she wanted to know him better. He declared that he knew the Emperor best, They were childhood companions, so Sharon could ask him anything about His Majesty without restraint. The protagonist wondered what the Emperor would think if his personal maid and his old friend hit it off. Meanwhile, the Emperor's army continued to demolish the Baron's estate. According to ancient tradition, the firing of cannons or catapults signified a direct order from the Emperor who would punish the traitor. The Baron guessed the Emperor had caught wind of his collusion with the Chancellor. The guards asked if they should fight back, and the Baron raged. Nonsense. 3 years ago, no one thought the Emperor was a coward, afraid for his throne and posing a threat. The Baron knew those victories on the battlefield weren't just luck. The war showcased Julian's wit, intelligence, and everything. The nobles panicked, worried he would die without an heir. The Emperor consolidated his throne, amassing a loyal army of commoner soldiers, most of whom were initially street urchins with no discipline. The Baron panicked at first, but then he realized the shelling was just a warning. The man knew that any further delay would incur His Majesty's wrath, so he ordered the guards to open the gates at once. He greeted His Majesty, hailing him as the radiant son of the Empire. Suddenly, a woman's anguished cry pierced the air, calling for her father. The Baron looked up to see his daughter, Janice, trembling and begging for mercy. He demanded to know why his daughter was in such a disheveled state, locked in a cage. Julian explained that there had been a scene at the banquet where Miss Itten had publicly slapped his personal secretary. The secretary had lost 5 teeth and coughed up blood for days afterward. The Emperor claimed it broke his heart and said he was here to announce that Miss Itten would pay the price. Though the girl insisted it was just a slap, the Baron was heartbroken by his daughter's betrayal. He blamed himself for entrusting his daughter to the future empress, only to have her fall into the jaws of a viper. He knew that under imperial law, his daughter could be executed for this. Worse, the gates were open, the Emperor had arrived with his army, and the Baron hadn't even had time to prepare. He knew nothing. The Chancellor couldn't have been ignorant of the mess his daughter's maid had caused. He knew all the Emperor's plans, yet he hadn't warned Mr. Itten, not even a single message. Had that bastard decided to ruin young Janice just to get rid of Baron Itten? All the man could do was kneel before the ruthless monarch and beg for mercy. He pleaded with the Emperor to at least spare his wife and daughter. Julian noted that Baron Itten must have had this daughter when he was around 40. The Emperor added that now he understood why the girl was so immature. He hadn't had a chance to explain everything to her. He said he was a merciful ruler, but this was the last time he would forgive Baron Itten. He then ordered Lady Itten to be released and asked what the man planned to do next. Afterward, Lady Itten found Miss Sharon and begged her for forgiveness for herself and her family. The protagonist was shocked to hear this, as this person had recently called her worse than horse dumb. The redhead said she had only listened to the rumors circulating in the palace. Sharon thought that the Emperor must have severely punished the Itten family to make the noble lower her head, but it didn't matter. Janice asked the protagonist if she was forgiven. When Sharon said yes, the redhead beamed with joy. She thanked them and said, "What a relief." It was explained that the Emperor himself had made the bully apologize to the victim. It seemed he truly had a soft spot for his favorites. As the protagonist thought about how silly she had been for lying about her cheek, Lady Itten said she wanted to hear their lovely love story. Janice noticed that Sharon wasn't wearing her people's traditional clothes, presumably because of her and Princess Stuart. Then she shyly said she wanted to give Sharon a small piece of advice. Before the protagonist could respond, she was caught off guard as Janice stepped closer and whispered in her ear to be careful of Nobby. The audience might be wondering what Miss Itten was talking about, but the author didn't reveal it. The scene changed to Julian returning to the Imperial Palace. He looked seriously at his maid. Sharon stammered that she was relieved to see him back safe and sound. Then he asked her why she had changed her clothes. She remembered the Emperor specifically instructing her to wear her people's clothing at the banquet. The protagonist said that she felt the people in the palace thought her attire was too revealing. The Emperor asked if she was uncomfortable wearing that outfit. She hesitated, then nodded. Julian said that since that was the case, she could do what she thought was right. She offered to get him his medicine since he hadn't taken any during his trip, and the Emperor nodded. Sharon was surprised he agreed so readily, not refusing at all, which made her smile even wider. Then she recalled Janice's words about him liking her, and the smile on her face grew even brighter. No wonder Julian started coughing when his personal attendant missed him so much. After that conversation, His Majesty was working in his office. Suddenly, he heard the door creak open and a voice apologizing for the disturbance. The emperor looked up and saw two dark figures exuding a strange aura standing before him. Julian frantically shouted, "Who are these strangers? Who allowed them to barge in here in the dark?" The shadowy figures said they brought a surprise, but noticing their lord's confusion, they introduced themselves as Catherine and Colin and asked if he recognized them. Colin said that on the battlefield, he often heard the emperor miss Catherine's blackberry pie. Julian confirmed this, and the subordinates began urging their lord to take at least one bite. The emperor thanked Catherine and agreed. The subordinates smiled as they watched their lord stuff the pie into his mouth piece by piece. Suddenly, a woman's scream echoed through the hallway, calling out Colin's name. She smelled poison coming from the emperor's study. By the time Sharon, Colin, and Catherine rushed into the lord's office, it was too late. The redhead shouted, "What is going on here? Who are these people?" Catherine guessed they were just imposters wearing clothes identical to the emperor's servants. The emperor's aide asked what to do with them now, but the lord remained silent. Sharon asked his majesty how much he had eaten, but he didn't answer and collapsed. Sharon's voice reached Julian's ears. She had been trying hard for a long time, but it was no use. The lord had eaten too much. She said she had seen this kind of berry on her island. It looked like a blueberry, but was much more dangerous. It seems the poison has spread. We need to find an antidote as soon as possible, or the consequences will be dire. Colin insisted on calling the emperor's personal physician, but Catherine reminded him that those criminals had even bribed the guards. She doubted they could find a decent healer in the palace now. Sharon said she could make the antidote herself. A short while later, the protagonist had arrived at the herb garden, an hour's drive from the imperial palace. She asked the gardener if there were any plants with yellow flowers here. The man said he knew the plant, but all the harvest had already been sent to the imperial palace. You can only find it in the mountains over there. Those mountains were a long way off, but they had no choice. Sharon and Colin set off. Along the way, the protagonist said that it was all her fault, that it was her reckless actions that had made the Chancellor use magic so openly. Colin said he didn't think so, and the princess's marriage hadn't been announced yet. Sharon asked why Albin hadn't been punished for using magic, and Colin replied that there were two reasons: lack of evidence and political power. The people disguised as the emperor's servants were dead, leaving no crucial evidence to prove the crime. Furthermore, when Albin served as regent for the young emperor, he built a powerful force both inside and outside the palace. The case wouldn't even warrant a death sentence, and His Majesty might face backlash from the nobles. That's why the last banquet was crucial. The emperor hoped to sow the seeds to turn the nobles into a faction loyal to him. Sharon's heart sank, realizing Julian wasn't angry at all. He'd probably been expecting this to happen. Colin said they climbed high enough and still hadn't seen even a shadow of the plant, so Sharon suggested they split up the search. They had been searching for hours, and there was no time to waste. The poison was spreading through the emperor's body, and Sharon silently prayed for the herb to appear soon. The poison could start damaging His Majesty's organs at any moment. Suddenly, Sharon cried out. She started yelling to Colin, happily shouting that she had finally found the herb. Sharon intended to pull it out carefully, making sure not to damage the roots. Just then, a suspicious hissing sound echoed. A snake lunged at Sharon, and she screamed, startled by the sudden attack. Hearing the sound, Colin rushed over, anxiously asking what had happened. Sharon calmly announced that she had been bitten, but it wasn't a problem because the snake was non-venomous. Colin was exasperated, asking if they had to deal with snakes in a place like this. Then, he asked her, puzzled, why she was still holding it. She asked if he was hungry, saying they could roast the snake and have a quick bite. Colin started yelling, saying she was talking nonsense. She asked what was so strange about it, and he retorted, "Do people on your island really eat snakes?" Sharon said it was delicious, but they didn't have time to chat and had to return to the palace immediately. Colin couldn't comprehend for a moment. The emperor's condition had improved, and his complexion was much better. He looked much more lively. Sharon told Catherine, the head maid, that as long as His Majesty took the medicine every 2 hours, his condition would definitely improve. Catherine confessed that she never knew Sharon was so knowledgeable. Sharon explained that back on her island, she worked with herbs. She added that she had simply followed the advice and gone up the mountain. Catherine said, "If it weren't for you, I don't know what would have happened." She pointed out that one of the attackers was dressed exactly like her, meaning she had become a tool against the emperor. Catherine had been sent to serve the young monarch because of her poor family background and lack of power or influence. She had nothing but her life. The woman said she was incredibly grateful that thanks to Sharon, His Majesty's life had been saved and he could continue to fight and be able to continue to oppose the Chancellor. Catherine felt that fate had sent such a gifted girl directly to the imperial palace. Sharon replied that the head maid was too kind, and then she thought to herself that it would be nice if the emperor thought so too, not just Catherine. Sharon said they needed to focus on the matter at hand. She added that she wasn't sure what kind of magic the attackers had used and explained that it required very advanced magic to completely control someone's mind. The more dark magic accumulated in such a short time, the stronger the toxicity, and an ordinary person's body simply couldn't withstand it. Sharon used snakes as an example, explaining that once they strike their target, they die on the spot due to the effects of the venom. Meanwhile, Albin told his daughter that magic wasn't perfect or easy, and even creating an illusion required tremendous effort. He pointed out that if the illusion's appearance was similar to the target, the effect would be stronger, and hiding the poison required even more caution. The man sneered. A lowly slave actually saw through the magic and saved the emperor. It seems they found a pearl in a dung heap. Diana said that her father shouldn't have weakened the poison. He should have let them die on that mountain. The Chancellor asked Diana if she really couldn't handle a commoner without her father's help. He asked if it was because of the slave's appearance or her abilities. The princess curtly replied that it had nothing to do with any of that. Albin pointed out that a sorcerer shouldn't act recklessly. Death on the mountain was insignificant. Julian had to feel true cruelty. Meanwhile, the emperor dreamt he was endlessly falling into a dark abyss, his feet never touching the ground. But it didn't feel like a nightmare. Even as he fell, Julian could feel a warm body temperature beside him. When the emperor opened his eyes, he saw Sharon's worried face next to him. She immediately bombarded him with questions about how he was feeling and if he was uncomfortable anywhere. Then, guessing he might be hungry, she rushed to the kitchen. Julian, of course, wanted to stop her. Suddenly, one of Sharon's shoes flew off, and she slipped and fell. Julian went over to check if she was all right and told her to slow down. Sharon didn't react, not even flinching. The emperor leaned down and asked if she was all right. Then Sharon blurted out, "Your Majesty, does this mean you're disappointed in me?" Julian raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" She recounted Sir Colin's story, the one about all the unlucky incidents the emperor had suffered since childhood. Sharon said that when she realized the emperor could face a major disaster at any moment, she felt a suffocating sadness and fear, and then she realized that she fully supported His Majesty, not because of the contract, but out of genuine loyalty. Julian noticed her trembling and asked what was wrong. Sharon said that the emperor wanted a servant to block the magic, but the shield cracked, and he almost died. Sharon believed in her magic, but she failed to protect the emperor. She admitted she hadn't kept her promise and probably thought he was disappointed in her. Then, she lunged at the emperor, screaming that she would fix this and never let it happen again. She demanded he see her worth and begged for his trust. Julian frowned and snapped, "Get up this instant." Sharon froze, realizing their awkward position. She jumped away from the emperor like she'd touched a hot stove, stammering that that wasn't the kind of proof she meant. Julian chuckled, saying she didn't have to deny it so desperately. He hadn't even considered such an outcome. Then he asked the maid if she really thought her master was some kind of pervert. Julian extended a hand to Sharon, helping her up, saying the floor was cold. Sharon was relieved. She had been truly afraid the emperor would be angry and send her away. She knew that if she were dismissed, she wouldn't be the only one to suffer. Pachon, who had signed up to be a gladiator, would also suffer. Sharon really wanted to succeed, especially now that the emperor's gaze wasn't as harsh as when they first met. He asked Sharon about the bandage on her ankle, and she replied that some interesting things had happened in the mountains. Sharon was about to start explaining, but before the emperor could blink, she collapsed. Her master, startled, asked what had happened. Catherine said what was coming had finally come. Sharon was sick. Seeing the confusion on her master's face, the head maid pointed out that someone had used black magic. 2 days ago, in order to disguise the unknown attacker as a servant trusted by the emperor, a pie laced with poisonous berries had been baked and presented to His Majesty. He almost died, but Sharon found some herbs that helped neutralize the poison. Catherine said, "Your personal maid spent the entire day making the antidote, and to take care of you, Master she didn't close her eyes all night. Then the head maid pointed out that the girl was injured. Her ankle looked a mess. The emperor ordered Catherine to fetch some painkillers and healing ointment. As the head maid hurried off, the emperor couldn't help but feel a pang of irony. After all, the woman who claimed to be his mother had abandoned young Julian and fled for fear of the chancellor. Yet here was a humble maid, with nothing but her own life, who stepped up to protect the emperor and saved his life. He just couldn't understand why she apologized to him, why she threw herself into action with such disregard for her own well-being. Julian felt that Sharon was worried sick about him. Suddenly, Colin rushed in, yelling that Sharon had been bitten by a snake in the mountains. But he hadn't realized the full danger. Sharon felt fine, not even fainting. Colin examined her injured leg, muttering, "Phew, just a viper bite, not too serious." Suddenly, the emperor pushed Colin's hand away. His Majesty said that any careless touch could worsen Sharon's condition. Colin replied, "Hygiene is important, and all the decisions your Majesty makes are absolutely correct." The emperor asked his aide why he suddenly brought that up. He explained, "I'm referring to the emperor's choice to continue giving Sharon a chance." Precisely. Colin pointed out that although she was just an ordinary slave, and what she said didn't sound true, His Majesty, out of mercy, hadn't killed her. Instead, he freed her from those old shackles and gave her a chance to prove herself. Colin said those were the emperor's wisest decisions. Sharon is giving her all. The emperor said, "We're all lucky she ended up in the imperial palace. But luck also requires some prudence." As for Sharon, the emperor's clear train of thought seemed to cloud over. Julian felt his brain was completely useless here. The emperor personally applied the ointment to her leg and bandaged it. He felt that was enough, but Sharon wouldn't wake up anytime soon. Julian called the maid's name a few times, pleading with her to wake up quickly. Suddenly, Sharon opened her eyes, but everything was still blurry, so she didn't hesitate to call the emperor sitting by her bedside Pachon, murmuring that she really missed him. She said he was the only one she had, and asked Pachon if he thought they could go back to that wonderful island of Sersum together. The emperor wasn't offended or angry. She was simply delirious with fever. Homesickness was natural, but Sharon had become a slave at 17, struggling in harsh conditions until she arrived at the palace at 20. Julian thought that Sharon and Pachon could return to that island safely enough, but what then? The same poor, tedious life awaited them. Julian began to think that securing a foothold in the empire and protecting his own interests might be the wiser course of action, and enjoying the luxuries that island certainly didn't have. He tried to tell himself it was just ordinary sleep talk, nothing to worry about, but the chaotic thoughts wouldn't leave him in peace. He silently prayed that Sharon wouldn't reveal her secret desires so loudly again, because some people envied those who could dream so recklessly. A few days passed, and everything returned to normal. But something had changed. The head maid, Catherine, now managed all the food that came to the emperor. At that moment, the girl realized her magic wasn't as strong as the Chancellor Albin's. Confidence and desire alone weren't enough to properly protect the emperor. Sharon knew that even if she improved her spells, it might not be enough against Albin. Unsure of her next move, she contacted Pachon in her mind. She asked for help. Walking down the hallway, she asked Catherine if she could visit the gladiator training. Catherine, with obvious annoyance, asked if she really wanted to see that slave, Pachon. Sharon had assumed Catherine would refuse, given the current tension, but the woman said she could go after her tea as long as she got the emperor's permission first. Sharon had just opened her mouth to thank Catherine when Miss Stewart, Diana, suddenly appeared. She said she had heard the emperor was unwell and had come to visit. Catherine greeted Princess Diana and said she would escort her to the reception room. Sharon noticed that Miss Stewart looked completely different from how she had at the banquet. She now looked calm and dignified, like a true empress. The princess greeted the wisest ruler and son of the empire. Julian said he was very grateful that she had taken the time to visit him. Then he said that tea was ready. Diana said she was very worried when she heard he was ill and hoped he had fully recovered. Julian replied that everything seemed fine now. It was just a small incident, and they had taken care of it. Diana seethed inside. How could the emperor so lightly call it a small incident? The entire palace had been in chaos when His Majesty ate the poisoned pastry. But now Julian seemed fine, and Diana was relieved. Still, who would try to assassinate assassinate the emperor before his wedding. The girl wondered if the ruler had truly sensed magic. Could that slave from Salsam Island really pull off such a trick? It seemed things hadn't gone entirely according to her father's plan. Sharon apologized and said she needed to excuse herself. Julian said it was all right and Sharon could go. But the princess didn't miss a beat, approaching her as she left. Diana asked her name again, saying she had forgotten, and apologized for her maid's rudeness at the banquet. Then she asked, since they were essentially sharing a husband, why not try to get along like family? The girl was already feeling dizzy, but the next words completely floored her. Diana pointed out that the biggest question now was who would bear the imperial heir first. She said she was merely His Majesty's concubine and would be very happy if someone truly loved him, and that this meant Sharon could fulfill her duties and then return to her home island with Pachon. Julian sighed, wondering if Sharon would leave him too. He knew the sting of rejection too well. They had told the young Julian to live with hatred for her, to use that hatred to endure life's struggles, because he would become emperor and she would gain her freedom. He remembered she hadn't shed a single tear until the very last moment. Julian had tried to hold back too. His eyes burned, but he kept wondering if it would have been better if he had broken down and clung to her. Perhaps all the tears he had suppressed had turned into fear, forever gnawing at the emperor. It was the same now. Julian only snapped back to reality when Princess Diana asked if he was unwell. She asked again if His Majesty was feeling uncomfortable. He said everything was fine. He was just lost in thought. Gazing at him, Diana silently wondered if anyone in real life could be so beautiful. He was like a rose with thorns, unapproachable, untouchable, his heart closed off to everyone. But someone had managed to capture the emperor's attention. It was Sharon, born among the slaves of Salsam Island, his mistress. As the island girl left, Diana noticed the emperor's eyes darken with anger. It was a deep, primal emotion. Seeing that look, Diana made up her mind. She would win His Majesty's heart. Anyway, wouldn't things be easier if this silly girl could easily be charmed by Julian? On the other hand, her heart wasn't ready to fall in love, and a man like him couldn't make a woman happy. Diana decided she would use every advantage she could. An idea came to her mind, to make the target fall in love with her using a love potion. It was a long shot, but it was worth a try. If Diana ended up becoming empress and bearing an heir, her life would change forever. The princess smiled and told the emperor that she had prepared something special for him. Julian had absolutely no idea what it was. She had heard that sleeping with a love potion nearby would allow it to absorb your scent, making it more effective. So she had spent several nights doing this, but still worried whether the potion would work on a man so obsessed with another woman. Suddenly, the emperor stood up and walked somewhere. The princess tried to stop him, but only received an apology from the emperor. He explained that he had to leave urgently to deal with unfinished business. He wished the princess a safe journey. Meanwhile, an elated Sharon ran to see Pachon. She threw herself into his arms, declaring that she had missed him terribly. The boy asked Sharon how she was doing, and she replied that since she was serving in the imperial palace, wasn't the answer obvious. She added that the head, Maid, was also taking good care of her. Pachon listened to Sharon's story sadly, convinced that she was putting on a brave face. She even looked thinner than when she was a slave. He knew that although his friend claimed everything was fine, deep down, she was struggling with a lot of things. Suddenly, Pachon, in a serious tone, asked the girl to wait a little longer until he trained hard and defeated. Not his opponent. She protested, saying absolutely not, especially what if Pachon got hurt in the fight. He said that he might seem weak to her, but what she saw wasn't everything. Sharon could trust him because if a gladiator defeated their opponent in the arena, they had the right to request an audience with their master. Pachon said that the gladiator could ask that lord for anything, and they had to comply. So the girl just needed to wait. The boy promised he would definitely win, so they could return to Salsam Island together. Sharon agreed. When Pachon returned to the training grounds, it was already dark. He noticed everyone was more nervous than usual, so he decided to ask what was going on. They told him to look up, and Pachon saw His Majesty sitting on the throne on the raised platform. The boy bowed and greeted the supreme ruler and the shining sun of the empire. Julian calmly descended from the platform and asked the gladiator if his name was truly Pachon. The emperor mentioned that he had heard this slave brought from the island had decent skills. Julian gave the terrified boy a chance to demonstrate his gladiator skills, to duel and fight in the arena. A moment later, the gladiator stood opposite the emperor, his trembling hands gripping his sword tightly. Naturally, Pachon had no choice but to say it was his honor, and he would give it his all. But the emperor said whether it was an honor or not could only be known after the fight, and the fight would only end when one of them was defeated. And defeat meant death. As their swords clashed, Pachon thought to himself that this was a crazy, but not a bad, opportunity. If he succeeded, he could go home with Sharon. All of Pachon's hopes were dashed when he discovered the emperor was a master swordsman. Everyone watched in stunned silence as the emperor's blade flashed inches from the gladiator's face. Julian knocked the boy to the ground with a flurry of swift attacks. Clearly getting carried away, Julian roared that it would be an honorable death for a slave. Suddenly, someone grabbed his wrist. It turned out to be Collins, who smoothed things over with a laugh, suggesting they end the training and go home. The royal aide glanced at the injured Pachon and immediately understood why his master was so furious. But killing a useless slave wouldn't change anything. Suddenly, the emperor called out to Collins, asking if the slave should challenge Marcus. The red-haired man thought his master was joking. Marcus was the strongest gladiator in the empire. He had won 20 fights, killed 18 opponents, and left the other 2 permanently disabled. The emperor gave a sly smile and said he was just joking and had only made the suggestion because the slave had guts. Suddenly, Julian heard the injured gladiator cry out. He couldn't just give up. He pleaded with his master to give him another chance. He was willing to do anything to win that fight. His Highness told the slave to remember his place. Pachon hesitated, then muttered that he really could do it. The emperor sneered and said that if the slave was so confident in himself, let him defeat all the gladiators here first. On the way back to the castle, Julian wondered what made Pachon so pitiful. Why was he doing this? Why was he fighting so desperately? Why was he so desperate to beg for another chance? Was it because Sharon was meeting him behind his master's back? Did she really like him that much? Julian told himself not to think of the girl as anything more than a simple servant, the one who used magic every night to help his majesty fall asleep, because he couldn't sleep on his own. There was only a contract between him and the girl, nothing more, nothing less. Suddenly, Julian was pulled from his thoughts by his aide's question, "Does Her Majesty like Sharon?" The emperor, at first, couldn't even believe it, demanding he explain himself. Collins pointed out that he knew His Majesty didn't easily develop feelings for people, adding that he only asked because His Majesty was acting as if he had feelings for the servant. The emperor told him to think before he spoke. The man pointed out that there was no reason to be so harsh with the gladiator, and the reason the emperor was angry with Pachon might be because of something between him and Sharon. He told Julian not to overthink it, and to just admit the plain truth, which was pure jealousy. Julian replied that it was impossible for the emperor's son to have feelings for a commoner. He should just take what he wanted without getting attached. It would be absurd for the supreme ruler to fall for a woman's heart. Just as His Majesty was trying to explain, it was a misunderstanding. Sharon appeared and greeted the emperor with a bright smile. She said she came to help His Majesty and took his sword. As the servant touched him, Julian's heart raced and his cheeks flushed. She found the sword to be much heavier than it looked, then asked, "Why is it covered in blood? Did you really send another warhorse away this time?" The emperor didn't understand at first, but then realized and asked, "What if it's not horse blood? What if it's human blood?" She chuckled. "Impossible. We're not on the battlefield. Besides, the emperor isn't the type to act recklessly with a blade in his hand." He thought, "Does this maid really think I'm a good person? I wonder how she'll react when she finds out the truth." "It's Pachon's blood," Julian thought to himself. Sharon knew nothing about him, completely unaware of what he was willing to do to get what he wanted. She did understand that Emperor Julian didn't need feelings to get what he wanted. He just took it. The emperor approached her and asked, "How long do you think I can pretend to be a good person around you?" Sharon lay in bed, replaying the emperor's words in her mind. He's not a good person, and he doesn't intend to pretend to be. He wondered if this meant the girl would be forever trapped by his side, serving only him. Besides that, there was another thing that bothered Sharon. It happened a few days ago when she brought His Majesty some red string, saying she got it just to tie around his ankle. The emperor looked at the spool of string and thought it was a joke. Does she think this thing is strong enough? He felt like the string could snap at any moment under tension. Sharon laughed and said that even if it broke, they could just replace it with another string. But Sharon noticed the emperor's face darken in an instant and asked, "What's wrong?" The emperor didn't answer, but threw the spool of string aside and grabbed Sharon's throat. Sharon begged him to stop, but he didn't budge. Her tears slid over the back of his hand, but he only tightened his grip. Suddenly, he seemed to come to his senses, releasing her and opening his eyes wide with shock. He asked what just happened? Sharon realized he wasn't pretending. It was genuine confusion, like he had just woken up from a deep sleep. No wonder he had been so distracted. He had recently survived an attack in his own palace. The attacker had disguised themselves as someone he completely trusted. Meanwhile, Miss Stewart walked out of the palace, taking a stroll under the starry sky. She couldn't understand how the emperor could just leave like that. Why be so harsh if he wasn't interested at all? Her father had told her that he didn't understand how a woman could be born without knowing how to attract a man's gaze. A true beauty only needed a smile and a glance. So what could a daughter do? Diana sadly realized she wasn't a natural beauty, nor did she have that kind of talent. What was left for her? She hadn't even managed to make the emperor drink that damn potion. Then, the princess heard some strange shouts, which sounded like fighting. Who will be training this late? All the imperial knights should be preparing for bed. Diana peeked around the corner and spotted the imperial gladiator, Pachon. He noticed Miss Diana and asked if she was lost. Diana said she had come out for some tea during her walk and somehow ended up here. She lied. The cup actually contained wine. But Pachon had already introduced his name and status. She joked about his strange name and exotic face. The gladiator offered to escort the lady to the inner palace gardens. As soon as Diana agreed, the nearby bushes rustled. He pushed the lady aside, told her to wait, and went to investigate. A small cat darted out from the bushes. "That's Nobby, my cat," Diana said. "Grandfather sent him. He's worried about his lazy granddaughter." "He naturally wouldn't take his eyes off you," Pachon said. He immediately thought that, obviously, the cat was just following its owner, as it wore a golden collar. Perhaps slightly tipsy from a drink or two, Diana reacted well to the man's words. Feeling a little embarrassed, she shot him a playful glance. But then she suddenly let out a scream loud enough to shatter the room. She had seen the bloodstains on Pachon's neck. She asked him if he was truly injured, and Pachon said it was just a small cut from training. Diana panicked and offered him her handkerchief to wipe the bleeding wound. Of course, for a moment, she felt a pang of sadness. This handkerchief was meant for Julian, but he probably wouldn't even notice a girl like her. Diana no longer cared about the so-called magic. She never really believed the love potion would work, and now she was sure it was utterly foolish. Pachon thanked the princess for the handkerchief, saying he didn't know how to repay her. The girl told him not to worry about it, that he owed her nothing, because the man's face reminded her of a puppy. Besides, Diana was happy to help the man she had met during her late-night stroll. Later, in the Imperial War Room, the Emperor summoned his highest-ranking officials for a meeting. Lord Albert raised an eyebrow and asked, "Now that your majesty has recovered, how are you feeling?" The old man had nearly gone mad when he heard that the young emperor was unwell. Julian simply smiled, meeting the chancellor's bold gaze. He said there was no need to worry, as it was merely a petty trick played by some backstabbing scoundrel. The chancellor found the emperor's choice of words amusing, but something about them didn't sit right. He reminded Julian that he had been taught from a young age to choose his words carefully. All the other council members cowered in fear, not daring to utter a word. Albert thought to himself that the emperor was getting bolder, but that didn't mean they could let him walk all over them. He proposed a hunting competition, suggesting his estate as the perfect venue. The chancellor added that it would simply be a celebration of the emperor's recovery. Julian said, "Sounds fun, but I'll have to sit this one out. Organizing such an event and dealing with so many people would be a huge hassle, not to mention the budget." The chancellor waved it off with a laugh. "Don't worry," he said. "After all, if I'm the one hosting, I'll make sure nothing goes wrong." He then excused himself, saying he had some urgent business to attend to. Colin asked, "A hunting competition on the chancellor's territory. That's suspicious, isn't it?" The emperor explained, "It's obvious. Albert wants to prove to the nobles that he's more capable than I am, and he's not planning on letting me off the hook so easily. It seems he's taken the emperor's dinner plate for his personal kitchen laboratory, specifically for culinary experiments." Julian suggested breaking the chancellor's spine to teach him a lesson, that it's rude to help oneself to another's food without permission. Collins pointed out that the chancellor's territory was basically enemy territory, and who knew what threats lurked there. Most importantly, the chancellor also has a fearsome private army. The emperor asked, "Isn't there a safer, more effective method. His aide had a sudden idea. Perhaps this time, Your Majesty, you could actually make use of your good looks. The emperor didn't understand at first, but the aide explained that now was the perfect time to take full advantage of His Majesty's appearance. After all, seducing Lady Diana Stewart and bringing her over to His Majesty's side would be a foolproof plan. The emperor flew into a rage. Why should I let that Albin get away with such a despicable tactic? If you want to play these games, over the years, Albin has sent all sorts of spies, many of them stunning beauties, but none have managed to win the emperor's favor. Collins had underestimated the heart of a ruthless monarch in the past, but things were different now. The red-haired man added that Miss Stewart was bound to become empress, but what happened after that was entirely up to the emperor. Julian asked his aide what he meant by that. Collins suggested His Majesty consider it a strategy to secure the throne. He reminded the emperor that he had vowed to live only as an emperor, and not as an ordinary man. Julian agreed. He had sworn to erase from his heart anything unrelated to the throne. The emperor thought that if he truly did that, he could do whatever he wanted with the chancellor's daughter. Colin was right. The important thing was possession, not emotional investment. But honestly, was it really that easy? Julian realized he was just a little lost. He had never felt this way before. However, this feeling would soon pass. For an emperor, emotions were a fatal weakness, best nipped in the bud before they could take root. A short while later, something interesting was brewing in the imperial palace. Miss Stewart thanked His Majesty for the invitation. The emperor smiled, greeting his guest and gesturing for her to sit. She admitted that after some thought, she realized she might have been too harsh with her words last time. The emperor asked her to clarify what had happened last time. The princess retorted, "Don't tell me you've forgotten." She reminded him that she had barged in uninvited last time, brazenly interrupting his work. His Majesty apologized for abruptly ending their conversation last time, saying it was quite rude of him. Diana felt talking to Julian was as difficult as talking to her father, making her chest tight. She decided to change the subject, mentioning that her father had been training tirelessly for the hunting competition. The emperor said he was looking forward to it. Just then, Sharon appeared. The princess blinked. Had Julian really invited this girl to lunch? Sharon said she brought wine, hoping the princess would like it, then quietly slipped away. She watched them chatting happily, clearly immersed in their own little world. Diana called out to Sharon, asking if she was really just leaving, then suggested she at least stay for a drink. The maid was taken aback, saying she appreciated the offer, but she didn't drink. The princess insisted she sit down. The emperor added that it was rude to refuse an elder's kindness. Sharon had no choice but to agree. The princess smiled, telling Sharon they saw eye to eye on this matter. She confessed that nobles should understand wine, but unfortunately, her taste buds stubbornly refused to cooperate. Julian said the wine was a table wine, so it wouldn't be too strong, and Miss Diana would be fine. The maid thought to herself, the emperor's voice was so gentle, she didn't even know he could speak like that. The princess asked, since His Majesty is so kind, how could I refuse? The emperor and the daughter of the Stuart nobility. A match made in heaven. Sharon finally understood. She realized her true position, remembering she was just a common slave. The whole court already knew that His Majesty's madness had subsided. So, once this political marriage went smoothly, the maid could finally leave the palace. But even so, should Sharon really continue to pretend to bask in His Majesty's favor? The girl noticed the emperor and the princess were a harmonious pair. Diana thanked her. She thought to herself, it was all fake. They were just drinking and laughing together. The princess asked Sharon if she thought there was someone more suitable for her. After asking this question, the emperor's gaze locked onto the maid, closely watching her reaction. Our maid blushed. Julian frowned, muttering that the meat was delicious, but too tough. Diana, noticing Sharon's distressed reaction, quickly changed the subject. Diana was stressed. She needed to practice riding for the competition, but she knew nothing about it. The emperor gave the princess a spot in the competition. She hesitated, remembering Sharon's previous reaction. After a moment, Diana nodded, putting on a fake smile and saying that a girl from an island was probably quite good with horses. The maid had no choice but to agree, even though she had only worked in the stables and never ridden a horse as a slave. Those memories pained her, and she suddenly felt a strong urge for a drink. Of course, the princess and the emperor noticed immediately. The protagonist was stunned by the pleasant taste, suddenly understanding why people enjoy drinking. Sharon happily licked her lips. Julian was stunned, watching her wide-eyed, surprised expression, and smiled playfully. But then I asked myself, if Sharon is just a personal servant, why would you be so agitated for her? The emperor realized that, even though she was right under his roof, he gazed at her like she was a priceless treasure. Diana caught that look, thinking how sweet it was. He was burning with passion, while she wouldn't even look at him. Her feelings for him were nowhere near as intense as his obsession with her. Diana thought to herself, to gain the title of Empress, she had to avoid conflict, especially with Sharon, which could be dangerous. Sharon apologized for her behavior, vowing never to touch another drop of alcohol. But she jokingly pointed out that it was the emperor himself who bestowed the wine, so everyone had to obey and take a sip. Her pathetic life was suffocating her, and she thought perhaps a drink could help, even if only for a second. She apologized and hurried off, clearly flustered and uneasy about the whole thing. The emperor couldn't help but watch the departing servant. After dinner, Julian kept thinking about his feelings for Sharon, his heart filled with a shameful turmoil. He cursed himself for being a fool, trying to forget Sharon for a long time, but thoughts of her lingered. Julian bitterly mocked himself. He was probably going to have another sleepless night. He wondered where his personal servant had gone when he needed her most. Suddenly, Catherine appeared, surprised to see His Majesty had returned. He anxiously looked around, asking the head maid where Sharon was. The lady said Sharon had dinner with the emperor. She added that she had just cleaned and checked every room, but Sharon was nowhere to be found. The emperor said the maid was right, explaining that Sharon had too much to drink and probably wanted to get some fresh air. Catherine pointed out that Sharon never disappeared without reason, especially when the master needed his insomnia medicine. The emperor felt despair, wondering how his thoughts and dreams could be completely controlled by someone else. His Majesty made excuses for the maid's absence, despite Catherine's attempts to argue. He said she was probably in the garden and not to worry. But even after returning and changing his clothes, Julian couldn't shake his anxious thoughts about Sharon. Though it was late, he left his chambers. The guard tried to stop him, but he ordered them to stand down and ask no questions. Julian's chest tightened, his heart racing. Despite his anxiety, he forced himself to remain calm. He suddenly realized where Sharon had gone, straight to the slave. The emperor was still grappling with Diana's question. Did Sharon think there was someone more suitable for her? It was absurd that a slave could cause the emperor such turmoil. Julian felt as if struck by lightning. Sharon was betraying her master. This was the third time she had vanished without a trace. She had disregarded her duties. As His Majesty passed the stables, he noticed a light within. He peered inside and found Sharon curled up asleep in a pile of hay. He wondered if she was dead drunk, but that was completely unlike her. Julian was too shocked to speak, but he carried her back to the palace. He reminded himself that he had vowed to let go of his feelings for his personal maid. He knew that if he brought her back now, she would forever occupy his thoughts. He gently traced his fingers across her cheek, wondering what to do with his subordinate. Night fell, and Princess Diana, as usual, went for a walk after dinner. She was already plotting how to control the empire, studying the weaknesses of her father and the emperor. The ideal plan was to bear a prince and have him outlive everyone, making her the sole heir to the empire. But for the plan to succeed, she needed these two men. However, the emperor was oblivious to his infatuation with another girl, and the prime minister was elusive. The greedy Diana was in a predicament, unable to figure out how to seize the country. She decided that for now, she had to tolerate these two to achieve her goals. But the princess was a cold pragmatist, ready to discard them should they become a threat in the future. The moon rose high, illuminating the sky. Diana felt that such a moonlit night was perfect for getting drunk. Unfortunately, she had to suppress herself and feign composure. It was better to be drunk than to pretend. The princess dismissed her maids, wanting to be alone. Suddenly, something caught her attention. On the ground, several polished stones glimmered. It felt wrong, as if deliberately placed. It could be a marker or a trap. But Diana then recalled her recent encounter with Pachon and his words, "You just happened to get lost on your walk." Then, the princess understood. He had left the markers, thinking she would get lost again. Just then, she suddenly heard a sound. Meanwhile, the palace was on high alert, searching for Sharon. Collins complained of exhaustion, muttering about why the emperor was suddenly making such a fuss over Sharon. It was baffling. Her behavior made Collins chuckle inwardly. His mother feigned calmness, but inside, she was a mess. She ordered him to continue the search and keep the guards on standby, as Sharon was the key to His Majesty's peace of mind. Collins wondered if His Majesty had finally made up his mind. Catherine asked him what he meant. Collins replied that she knew exactly what was going on. The headmaid immediately understood her son's insinuation about the Emperor and his personal maid, a relationship everyone knew but no one dared to mention. Catherine flew into a rage, yelling at her son and denying everything, calling it all an act. Julian has a terrible obsession. Whether it's reading, dueling, anything he starts, he pursues to the very end. Frankly, beneath his gentle exterior lies a heart of ice. When he wants to be ruthless, he can be more ruthless than anyone. He won't play the nice guy. For Julian, love is control, not care. And Sharon might just be his next obsession. Catherine continued, "That's why I have to cut this off before he loses control completely. Sharon has a rebellious streak in her. She'll fight for her independence at all costs. She's like a small fish. The harder you try to grasp her, the more she'll slip through your fingers." Catherine told Collins that his duty was to ensure His Majesty never had to confront his feelings, to make him believe it was all a bad dream. Collins' mind went blank. Was this peace achieved by lying to save someone? And who was the real winner in all of this? Collins raged at how insane it all was. He understood they were asking him to personally stifle the Emperor's emotions in the name of the Empire. The royal aide speculated that Sharon, having been a slave, might have hidden in some unreachable dark corner. Suddenly, he heard a noise. Collins listened carefully and realized it was laughter coming from around the corner. When he peeked around the corner, he gasped. He saw Pachan and Princess Diana flirting. Collins stared in surprise at the clandestine meeting, wondering why they were strolling together under the moon. And worse, this Pachan was the man Sharon had feelings for. But judging by his expression and body language, he didn't seem the least bit afraid of Princess Diana. Collins muttered irritably, "Great, the Emperor's nowhere to be found when we need him." Meanwhile, the Emperor was preoccupied with a weighty matter. He couldn't admit that he needed Sharon, not as an antidote, but as a lover, so he buried himself in paperwork. The contract with Sharon would remain valid until his insomnia was cured and he was married. That was why, regardless of her status or feelings, he couldn't just let Sharon go. Keeping Sharon by his side was also a political move. Albert was a threat to the throne, and the Emperor needed Sharon until Albert was eliminated. Julian decided to turn back. The Emperor's promise had to be kept, but less than a minute later, he came running back in a panic. Julian kept telling himself that as a true gentleman, the Emperor couldn't leave a drunken woman alone. That was something only a scoundrel would do. He just had to look after the girl until sunrise and then slip away unnoticed. Sharon was filled with regret, thinking she must have been crazy to get so drunk in the stables. The thought of being discovered by the head Maid filled her with dread. A glaring Catherine stood before her in her mind, and the girl paled. She announced that a hunting competition would be held in Rivers tomorrow, and everything had to be prepared in advance, ensuring His Majesty wouldn't experience any inconvenience. The girl vowed to quit drinking from that day forward. Later, Sharon went to the Emperor's chambers. With downcast eyes, she apologized, saying she didn't remember how she got back last night and should have woken up earlier to prepare breakfast. The Emperor coldly pointed out that even a little extra wine at dinner could impair one's judgment. Sharon's nervousness was evident, her trembling fingers betraying her emotions. The Emperor leaned in with an air of superiority, watching her blush. She timidly suggested withdrawing from the hunt, not wanting to be a burden to His Majesty or the princess. Julian barely heard her words as she clarified that she only hoped they could get along. His Majesty told the maid to stop overthinking and stick to her duties. He warned her not to meddle and to know her place. Servants shouldn't interfere in the future Empress's affairs. The day of the hunting competition finally arrived, and the guests grumbled amongst themselves, wondering where the monarch's beloved had disappeared to. They asked in astonishment, could it be that the Emperor has chosen Diana after all? Others muttered, don't try to guess the tyrant's mind. Julian's eyes widened, and the other nobles couldn't look away either. All eyes were fixed on the stunning Sharon. The gossip mongers began whispering again. Could she be the one the Emperor has his eye on? They hadn't been wrong about the rumors of her beauty circulating in the court, but now they were more curious about the man beside her. The nobles present were stunned that they were riding together. Witnessing this, Diana grimly pondered what game they were playing. Before setting off, Collins told the Emperor that he would handle the Lord's affairs today, so he needn't worry. Julian nodded, indicating his trust in the young man. But now he regretted his choice, sighing miserably. Sharon and Collins, standing together, looked even more compatible than he'd imagined. The scene looked as if the royal wedding had already taken place. Sharon suddenly gasped in shock. The head maid was riding past, looking valiant and stunning. Catherine sighed. It's a shame women can't be knights. I'm sure I could handle it, Collins said to his mother with a smile. I bet you can't beat me riding to the river. He missed their competitions. But Catherine scoffed, trying to cut your losses already. I'll win anyway. Someone asked if the Emperor wanted to compete as well. The Emperor narrowed his eyes. Do you think I ascended the throne just to play games? Catherine jumped in, saying she would ride first. Colin retorted, if my mother were a knight, she'd be twice the hero Jalek was. Sharon frowned. You mean the knight who cursed the royal family? Colin nodded. Yes, she was falsely accused of witchcraft. Her name has been cleared. History has vindicated her. Sharon's voice dropped. Even though she did so much for this country, they still killed her. Sharon frowned. Why was Colin so calm about this? She shouted, Colin, hurry up or you'll be last. Colin grinned. It's one thing when the person you care about is far ahead, but it's agonizing when they vanish without a trace. Sharon pressed. Is there something you're not telling me? Colin shrugged. No, I'm just saying Mother will reach the river before any of us. Colin muttered. His Majesty has been looking over his shoulder a lot lately, acting suspicious. Sharon nodded. He's been acting strangely. Colin asked, what's he doing? It's so odd, Sharon said. The Emperor has been much colder to her recently. She paused, wondering if she had done something wrong to cause His Majesty's recent distance. She thought that perhaps there were other issues she wasn't aware of, but she was willing to do whatever it took to make amends. Colin just shrugged dismissively, saying the Emperor had always been a cold person. Sharon argued that this wasn't normal. The Emperor barely wanted her near him these days. She muttered to herself that this high-pressure job was truly exhausting. It would be better to shovel manure than to walk on thin ice every day. Meanwhile, the story shifted to the Prime Minister's estate. A mouse scurried towards a tree stump, rustling the bushes. A cat leaped from the shrubbery, its jaws clamping down on the helpless creature in an instant. Now it remained to be seen whether the audience could guess what the author was trying to convey and whether this was some kind of metaphor. Finally, all the guests arrived at the hunting competition grounds and settled into their respective tents. As expected, Collins and Sharon were the last to arrive. He said he had to greet His Majesty first. He asked Sharon what she planned to do, but she said she just wanted to stay in the shade for now. Collins promised to join her later, and the girl headed towards the woods, only to bump into Princess Diana. Diana gushed excitedly about finally seeing Sharon here, but the princess seemed flustered and clearly not pleased by the reunion. The princess said she just wanted to chat with her maids, and Sharon wasn't who she really wanted to see, but she had no choice. Meanwhile, Collins asked the Emperor, aren't you curious why Sharon's assistant was late? Julian raised an eyebrow and scoffed. I'm well aware of the assistant's writing skills. The man replied, more than that. We had a very interesting conversation with the young lady on the way here. He complained, you don't care at all about what we discussed. His Majesty retorted, I don't want to know in the slightest. Collins continued to chatter about how well he got along with Sharon. The red-haired man finally got the hint when Julian, visibly irritated, gripped his sword. He said he needed to visit his new friend, but when he stepped out of the royal tent, he bumped into Albert and his secretary. Oh dear, what a surprise, Prime Minister Albert showing up here. It couldn't be anything good. But His Majesty's expression remained unchanged. With Miss Stewart right in front of him, Collins began to wonder if trusting his gut feeling was a mistake. But this wasn't his war. Not long ago, Julian considered Diana as troublesome as Albert, but now, even if things got worse, he accepted the truth and his fate. The crown was always a heavy burden. After all, everything had been resolved, one way or another. There were no sparks between Sharon and the Emperor, and there never would be. Now, they would each accept their designated fates and stick to their roles. Someone mentioned that this was a great opportunity to visit the Prime Minister's residence. They said it was built by a famous architect from the Florentine Empire, a true masterpiece. Albert chuckled and assured everyone that it was nothing special, just that he had seen a cozy farmhouse in Florence and thought he'd build something similar. Julian sneered inwardly, thinking how brazen it was to call a luxurious mansion built with the people's tax money a farmhouse. The monarch was appalled by Albert's false modesty. He just wanted to show off in front of the nobles, to display the power of Prime Minister Walden, whose wealth surpassed even the royal families. To a seasoned politician like him, the young emperor was just a child. Julian sneered and said he was also curious to see the prime minister's magnificent palace. Then he added, "I almost forgot I should call a farmhouse." Albert forced a smile, insisting that it really was just a humble farmhouse, not fit for an emperor's visit. Julian replied sarcastically, "That's a shame." Mentally, he labeled the prime minister a greedy old man. Incidentally, the cat jumped down from the prime minister's lap, off to explore and hunt. No one had yet noticed the bloodstains on the cat's collar. Meanwhile, the ladies were having tea, discussing the emperor's unusually kind attitude towards Miss Stewart today. Diana blushed and fidgeted, saying, "I'm actually a little embarrassed now, if it was that obvious." Sharon smelled a sweet floral scent, as if she were in a clearing deep in the forest. The scent transported her back to her homeland, the island of Salsam. Just then, the princess came over and asked if she liked the tea. She explained that it was one of the Empire's specialties. Diana joked that tea, unlike wine, was hot, so Sharon shouldn't drink it all in one gulp. Sharon thanked the princess and then noticed the maids snickering. They were barely suppressing their giggles. One maid apologized insincerely. "Oh, if you're from Salsam, it's understandable that you don't know basic etiquette." Her friend told Sharon to stop shopping for trendy clothes and learn some manners, because flirting wouldn't keep a man captivated forever. The princess's maids were humiliating her, and Sharon was both furious and shocked. So the princess had never cared about her. She just wanted to humiliate her. But there still hadn't been any progress between the emperor and the island girl. Miss Stewart was still angry. A girl who only shone on the surface couldn't mend the emperor's broken heart or form a deep connection with him. Had she messed up? Was it her fault that the emperor had been so cold lately? The blonde girl remarked that she hadn't expected the roles of the emperor's favorite and the princess to switch so quickly. She added that the princess had already caught the emperor's interest, so true nature was what mattered most. The princess smiled and said she was also surprised that the emperor had opened his heart to her so quickly. A maid mentioned that the emperor had finally noticed Miss Stewart's inner beauty, and suddenly someone asked Sharon if she was hurt by this. The princess guessed that these words might be a bit harsh for her, and told Sharon not to take them to heart. One lady summarized that it was truly pathetic when you had nothing left but to cling to someone who had already moved on. This statement completely enraged the protagonist. At that moment, it dawned on her that this tea party was designed to mock her. She realized she had been tricked by Diana's offer to chat, just like at that dinner party. Catherine, the head maid, suddenly appeared with a tray of desserts, happily announcing that she was pleased the nobles had accepted Sharon. She also said it was a delight to see the ladies getting along so well. Everyone seemed to like the girl, with Lady Eaton being the obvious exception. The princess scoffed, wondering when Catherine had become so concerned about Sharon. Catherine replied that on the day of that strange dinner party, she had realized something. The sun of the empire only shines in one place. Diana understood the head maid's meaning, and she didn't like it one bit. Presumably, the audience was also curious to know what that sentence actually meant. The lady admitted that Sharon had indeed drunk too much that night and gone to the garden for some fresh air, but she didn't return until long after midnight. She said the emperor was very worried about Miss Stewart and searched all night before bringing her back to the palace. Diana smiled triumphantly, summarizing, "So that's what happened." Catherine thought to herself that, honestly, she didn't know where Sharon had gone that night. She didn't know what Sharon had done, but just before dawn, she encountered the emperor, who looked like he hadn't slept all night. She asked His Majesty where he had been all night and if he had insomnia again. Catherine said that Sharon hadn't returned yet, but His Majesty replied that there was no need to look for her. The head maid was stunned. The emperor told her to pretend nothing had happened when Sharon returned. As the emperor walked past, Catherine noticed straw falling from his clothes. She wondered, had His Majesty been in the stables all night? The mention of the stables immediately made Catherine think of Sharon. Princess Diana laughed. "You're worrying over nothing." But Catherine replied, "No, it's not like that. That girl from the islands is too kind-hearted to do anything wrong." Miss Stewart was so angry she couldn't speak, completely unexpected of how things had turned out. The princess's friends were stunned by the head maid's words. One whispered, "So Princess Diana has completely lost face this time." Miss Stewart feigned regret, saying I shouldn't have involved Sharon. Thank you so much for telling me this, Catherine. She suddenly said she remembered she had to rush to visit her father and would tell them everything when she got there. The princess's friends also said they would do the same and thank Sharon for the wonderful time. When Sharon was the only one left at the table, Catherine said that all the desserts she had painstakingly made were now going to waste. She complained that the ladies should have at least tried one before leaving. Sharon wondered aloud if what Catherine had said about what His Majesty did that night was actually true. Catherine said that the girl actually knew everything. After all, His Majesty couldn't even sleep peacefully without her. The protagonist suddenly understood why the Emperor had looked so terrible that day and why he had suddenly become so cold. Apparently, he was simply exhausted from spending the entire night searching for his personal maid. So, what Sharon saw that night wasn't just her overactive imagination after all. She knew she had disappointed His Majesty once again. The protagonist desperately wanted to know how to make it up to him. Suddenly, a small snow-white cat named Albert dashed into Sharon and Catherine's tent, and no one had yet noticed the bloodstains on its collar. The head maid was puzzled by the cat's appearance, especially since it was wearing a bell, indicating it was someone's pet. Sharon scoffed inwardly, "This is a cat." It looked more like a cross between a cat and a dog. Catherine declared that they must find its owner as soon as possible and reached out to pet it. But at that moment, the animal extended its sharp claws and scratched the head maid's arm. Sharon immediately rushed to Catherine's side and asked if she was all right. Catherine said she had just cried out in surprise, but honestly, it didn't seem like a big deal at the time. Sharon heard the princess calling the animal's name. Diana shouted Nabi and claimed she had finally found him. She said the cat should be reprimanded for scratching someone for no reason. It was very rude. Sharon's mind raced. Had she heard that name somewhere before? So this was the Nabi that Lady Eaton had warned her to stay away from. Collins rushed into the tent, urging his mother to get her wound bandaged. Catherine retorted that it was ridiculous. It was just a cat scratch. Even after seeing the doctor, the head maid's condition didn't improve. Sharon said that she cried out in pain every few minutes, and the wound kept twitching and burning. Black venom was seeping from the wound, invisible to the untrained eye, but obvious to her. The girl realized she'd been right all along. The animal was the culprit. The Prime Minister wasn't raising a cat after all. It's a monster, she declared. The poison is on its claws. That's why the head maid is in so much pain. Collins and Catherine stared at their mother, dumbfounded. In a stunned silence, Sharon said, "Human medicine won't work. And since this monster was magically created by the Prime Minister, it's even worse." She added, "There's only one way. We have to kill Nabi. It's the only way to lift the poison and the curse." Collins clearly hated the idea, but it was the only chance to save the head maid. Catherine complained about the unpredictable nature of life, but stressed that the Emperor must never find out. Sharon grabbed Sir Collins and began whispering in his ear. Just then, the Emperor approached the tent. The moment Julian stepped inside, he noticed Sharon touching his aide. But instead of explaining, Sharon rushed out of the tent, apologizing profusely, saying they were pressed for time. The Emperor gave her a look of pure disdain. Sharon said she had nearly had a heart attack after bumping into His Majesty on the path. Then she glanced at Collins, asking, "What's with that face?" He mumbled, "Everything's fine." He raised an eyebrow. "So, what was that private conversation about?" She asked if he could lend her a dagger. She added that she felt this was something she had to handle alone, without outside help. Collins' eyes widened. "You think Sharon's going to do it herself?" She cut him off. "Precisely." She concluded, "I'm going to get rid of Nabi myself." She explained that if word got out now that the Prime Minister's pet was a monster and had attacked the head maid, everything would spiral out of control. The hunting competition would turn into a battlefield, and this was the Prime Minister's territory, all factors working completely against His Majesty. Collins was extremely dubious about the plan. He asked Sharon if she was really sure she could handle this alone. The girl agreed, but said she needed his help to distract the Prime Minister. Sharon said that if Collins could create a diversion, she would go after Nabi and end this before Catherine's condition worsened. Sharon said since she was participating in the hunting competition, she might as well test her skills. She'd always swung sticks around in the yard as a child. The hunt began, and everyone ran into the forest. Diana finally caught up with His Majesty, exclaiming, "There you are." She wanted to see the Emperor before the hunt began. She was curious to know if her family's land was up to the Emperor's standards, although the Prime Minister's estate was already world-renowned, wasn't it? Meanwhile, Julian barely listened to the princess, his eyes fixed on Collins and Sharon, who seemed to be standing a little too close for his liking. He wondered what they were whispering about. Even when Julian rode his horse at full speed across the river, he never looked back, his eyes locked on the horizon. But at some point, his senses, like a spiderweb, spread out, drawing his attention to Sharon and Collins without him even realizing it. Meanwhile, Albert prepared for the hunt like a madman, asking his dogs, "You miss the taste of blood, don't you?" He promised him a good show soon. Then a gunshot rang out. As the shot echoed, birds scattered in a panic, and the hounds barked and charged forward. Sharon and Collins watched curiously as the Prime Minister, head down, chased after the hounds. From the corner of his eye, Albert caught a glimpse of Sharon hiding behind a tree. The Prime Minister smiled smugly, noticing he was being followed. "Time to let Nabi hunt," he said. "Go on, kill to your heart's content. Don't hold back." Collins urgently called out to Sharon, "Nabi's coming this way. Be careful." She declared she was ready and told Sir Collins, "You watch your step too." Sharon gripped her sword, sending a silent message to the Prime Minister. Nabi wouldn't be returning to its master. Nabi was charging fast, and Sharon was ready to jump out and yell, "Stop." But a damn branch messed everything up. As she untangled herself, her gaze fell upon a magnificent mansion. Strange, how could such a beautiful house be hidden deep in the forest? Could this estate belong to the Prime Minister? Sharon wondered if this was the place she'd heard whispered about during the pre-hunt tea party. Rumor had it that Albert's estate was hidden in this forest, which was how Nabi was able to find it so quickly. She realized this could be a shortcut. If she could corner the cat inside, it would be easier to deal with it. The gardens looked well-maintained, but the mansion itself was deserted, dark, and gloomy, probably because the house was swallowed by the dense woods. Sharon wondered where the animal had gotten to. She was trying to figure out exactly what kind of monster Nabi was. If it was magically created, it wouldn't be easy to destroy. Then, she heard the faint jingle of Nabi's collar. Could the bloodthirsty animal be right behind her? Everything happened in a flash. Nabi's claws didn't just graze Sharon, they tore through her skin. She groaned from the sharp pain in her neck, but Nabi wasn't finished. Another attack was coming, so Sharon forced herself to stay calm and finish this. The author heightened the tension, cutting to a scene in the forest where the Emperor fired a shot, hitting his target dead center. Julian had shot down the deer. A group of nobles surrounded the Emperor, cheering about how amazing he was. Someone even shouted that they wanted to learn from him. Albert rolled his eyes in agony, his secretary murmuring that it would be awkward if the princess were here, because then they would have to choose between their future husband and their loving father. Albert sneered, saying the little Emperor was in his element. Then he asked with a smug grin, how long could this last? He was thrilled. After all, he had crafted and tamed this cat with his own hands. One touch of those claws or fangs, and the Emperor's most beloved woman would die. The Prime Minister couldn't wait to see the look on the Emperor's face when he found her cold, stiff corpse. The hunting competition was over. Sharon should be back by now. Collins was starting to panic. A terrifying thought crossed his mind. What if they were hunting her or something went wrong? The Emperor crept up behind him and asked, "What's got you so on edge?" Collins, the aide, jumped, saying the Emperor almost gave him a heart attack. He asked why he'd looked so nervous since the competition began. The man mumbled, "Is it that bad? I'll explain later." He said, "Remember that look on your face when your first crush got together with the prince of the neighboring country?" He grabbed Collins by the collar, hissing, "If you don't want to die, you better talk now." So Collins confessed that Sharon had gone after Nabi. Julian asked again, thinking he'd misheard. Collins repeated himself, adding that it was super dangerous. The Emperor was dumbfounded. He quickly explained everything, finally saying if we don't kill that cat, her mother is in danger. Collins laid out the whole plan. He was the bait, and Sharon would sneak in. Julian was furious. "Why didn't you tell me?" He roared. Collins reminded him that His Majesty needed to keep an eye on Princess Diana, and he didn't want to cause trouble on the Prime Minister's territory, because his mother was also there. He said he was prepared to take responsibility and bring her back at any cost. Maybe she was poisoned by the monster's venom. The Emperor retorted that he didn't have to do this. He added that he didn't see the need to go through all that trouble. His words cut deeper than any sword. Suddenly, it clicked for Julian. His emotions finally overpowered his cold logic. You can't just suppress your feelings like that. No matter how many times he tried, it was no use. Attempt after attempt, all for nothing. He declared that Sharon was his responsibility, and he would go find her himself. Meanwhile, Sharon was fighting for her life, locked in a deadly struggle with the bloodthirsty beast. Sharon froze, watching the purple blood drip from the edge of the dagger. There was only one possible explanation. With icy dread, she realized that standing before her was a living, breathing, furry monster. Thoughts sliced through her mind like razor blades. A single second of hesitation would be a fatal mistake. In her mind, she reached out to Nabi, telling it to remember her face, because it would be the last thing it ever saw. Sharon charged with the dagger raised, but the cat slipped away at the last moment. It laughed, asking her what the rush was. Its laughter echoed through the empty halls of the mansion, abnormally loud. The monster twisted like a snake, dodging the dagger. Suddenly, the elusive creature lunged at Sharon and bit her. The audience could probably imagine what kind of curses Sharon was hurling at the beast. Her heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't make the same mistake again. She swore the next attack had to be perfect. Sharon swallowed hard, gripping the dagger tighter. When the cat lunged again, she focused all her attention. The dagger found its mark. Blood splattered across the floor. Exhausted, Sharon collapsed, gasping for air. She scanned the room, muttering, "Where the hell is that bastard?" Her hand tightened around the hilt of the dagger. She could feel the enemy closing in, just as her strength began to fail. Weakness and tremors spread through her limbs. Her legs gave way, and she slumped to the ground. The world blurred. Passing out now was a death sentence. Sharon told herself to hold on. Then she heard footsteps outside the door. The door burst open. Sharon saw the Emperor standing before her. He looked down at her, calling her name in a gentle voice, then told her he knew everything. Julian asked if she had found and eliminated Albert's cat, but Sharon remained silent. So he asked again, but instead of answering, she let out a choked sob. From the very beginning, Julian was certain that no matter where he went, Sharon would eventually show up there, even if it made no logical sense. He felt an invisible thread connecting him to Sharon, so he rushed forward on instinct. The Emperor's heart was heavy with worry, plagued by terrible visions, his anger bordering on madness, because she always faced all the dangers alone. Yet, when Sharon saw her savior, all she could do was yell about some monster, babbling incoherently that it wasn't just a stray dog or some wild animal. She said it was a mutated creature, an unnatural being born of magic. Julian admitted he'd already heard about it from Collins, but he was curious why she hadn't told him. He was furious. Had Sharon completely lost her mind, confronting something so dangerous alone? He demanded to know what she would have done if she had died before he arrived, why she always shouldered everything herself. Sharon said she didn't want to bother His Majesty, and that it was the Prime Minister's territory. She added that the only thing that mattered now was making sure the monster stopped breathing. She explained that she had already wounded the creature several times, and it was surely hiding somewhere in the mansion. Sharon said they needed to confirm it was dead. The Emperor replied that he understood. Then, in a concerned tone, he said the girl had done enough, and she needed to rest now. Julian murmured that he would take care of the rest himself. Suddenly, Pachon appeared before her, disappearing into the murky water. She screamed for him to hold on, but in an instant, everything vanished. The protagonist wondered if it had all been a dream. As she turned around, feeling a burning heat, she realized everything was on fire. His Majesty stood amidst the blazing inferno. She thanked him for letting her rest, but the Emperor didn't react. She finally yelled at him, asking if he was all right. The protagonist asked what they should do. The mansion was ruined. How was she supposed to explain all this to the Prime Minister? Julian said he didn't care. Even if Albert demanded an investigation, it didn't matter. He complained that he felt awful, and his heart was beating irregularly. Sharon anxiously asked for details. Is it arrhythmia? The Emperor clarified that his heart was no longer obeying him, and the next second, he pressed his lips against the protagonist's. But she pushed His Majesty away with a furious yell. What does he think he's doing? Then, Julian announced that he had made up his mind. Sharon pleaded with the Emperor not to say it. He was taken aback. Why not? The girl retorted, how could she accept that His Majesty had feelings for her? The Emperor of Valdic was head over heels for a mere handmaiden from Salsam Island, despite having a noble lady by his side, far more suitable to be his empress. Sharon knew there was only a contract between her and the Emperor, just playing a role, nothing more. She couldn't forget her place. Julian told the girl she couldn't escape this now. It was all set in stone. Even he couldn't change it. He said he'd been terrified by these mad feelings, tried to run away, but his desires were tangled like a ball of yarn. The young man told her he couldn't resist anymore. He confessed that he craved not only the throne, but Sharon as well. She had gripped him like the thirst for power, and now, even his icy heart was burning. All the nobles, Julian, Albert, all gathered at the Prime Minister's palace. The Emperor said he understood the Prime Minister's distress over the fire at his estate, but it was unavoidable. Albert scoffed sarcastically, retorting as if there really was no other way. He kept saying he'd never seen anything so unavoidable in his life. His Majesty said that none of this would have happened if the Prime Minister's cat hadn't been a monster in the first place. He explained that the animal had attacked his personal maid and the head maid. They had to burn down the estate to eliminate it. The Emperor reminded the Prime Minister that if a monster poisoned someone, the only solution was to exterminate it. The nobles whispered amongst themselves, saying that burning down the Prime Minister's palace was an overreaction. But if the cat truly was a monster, it was understandable. Many wondered if Lady Stuart knew about this. The Prime Minister said that if the Emperor was so envious of the palace, he would have gladly given it to him. It was a shame things turned out this way. Julian pointed out how generous the Prime Minister was, but he had his own place, the Imperial Palace. He added enviously that his palace was far more comfortable than that gaudy shack built with the people's tax money. Julian asked, wasn't it a little absurd from the start for the Emperor to be reliant on a vassal? In his opinion, it was ridiculous, and it couldn't go on like this anymore.